Are you searching for the best in online black radio? Then go to blacktalkradionetwork.com, helping you filter through the noise. Real talk, black talk.
The internet is full of half-truths and all-out lies. We've all seen them, and many people on social media complaining about it. Here's your chance to show and prove. WorldAfropedia.com is a black-owned and operated encyclopedia. There are several thousand articles, but we need help. We can't uncover all the truth ourselves. So please, join us and become a writer, editor, or blogger for WorldAfropedia.com today. Every little bit counts. We owe it to the future generations to put the truth out there. Visit WorldAfropedia.com, the African-centered encyclopedia, a global database of African knowledge for the purpose of bringing about global African wisdom and understanding. WorldAfropedia.com.
Before we get started in the content that's in the description, I just wanted to read a short paragraph from the Wisdom of Psychopaths and just kind of get, if you could share some of your thoughts on what you think that book reveals about melanin deficient individuals on this planet, otherwise classified as white. The paragraph, it states, Joe Moulton, one of London's most successful venture capitalists, agreed in a recent interview with the Financial Times. He lists determination, curiosity, and insensitivity as his three most valuable character traits. No prizes for guessing the first two, but insensitivity. The great thing about insensitivity, explains Moulton, is that it lets you sleep when others can't, in quotes. If you had to give a quick tidbit about what you think that book reveals, The Wisdom of Psychopaths.
You know, the title alone is very revealing. Literally, it's in the title. You know, I mean, oftentimes you hear people saying you're not able to judge a book by its cover, but I think they're oftentimes processing the illustrations in the book, also in how the title can sort of like diplomatically give you an idea of what's in the book, depending upon whether or not the book is fiction or non-fiction. But obviously, The Wisdom of Psychopaths clearly is a book that's not designed to give people the impression that they are talking about some stuff from science fiction. And I think the full title of the book is The Wisdom of Psychopaths, Why Saints, Spies, and Serial Killers Can Teach Us About Success. That's the book you're talking about, right, by Kevin, right?
Yes, sir.
And just think about it. The wisdom of psychopaths, what saints, spies, and serial killers can teach us about success. Now just think about someone referred to someone as a saint. We all know that psychopaths, they have this incredible ability to be very, very charming. But I also think that it's very interesting that as he points out in the book, and he highlights even in the magazine that I referenced for you, The Mind by Scientific American, that the most psychopathic professions are CEOs, lawyers, and media personalities and surgeons. You know, I mean, those people are in the top 5. So that tells you that these people have to do what you just finished referencing. They have to be able to remove themselves from a situation without any sense of guilt or remorse or any type of compassion or empathy or sympathy for whatever it is they're doing. And the fact that the book is saying that there is wisdom there is telling you that this particular lifestyle has allowed people to take their knowledge and move it to a level of being wise in their deceit and indifferent as they deceive people and have no sense of having done anyone wrong. That alone tells you what the essence of the book is telling you about. If you want to be a powerful person, and we know in corporations the powerful person is the CEO, and if you know anything about the ER, the most powerful person in the ER is the emergency room, but in the OR is the surgeon. You know, everyone waits on the surgeon. The anesthesiologist would pretty much cue the surgeon, and the nurses are there to make things available to the surgeon. But the surgeon, unfortunately, in terms of how Dutton referenced them in The Wisdom of Psychopath. These individuals remove themselves from what they're doing to the degree that there is no type of emotion or sympathy, empathy for the patient. It becomes a sort of a sterile profession, if you will, according to The Wisdom of Psychopath. But he also points out that police officers can be insensitive, particularly those that are so well trained that they just follow their orders. So I think it's very obvious that the title of the book tells you exactly what you can find in the book. But more importantly, it's suggesting to, I would say, the lay reader or the curious reader that you can learn a lot about how to be quote-unquote successful or powerful or become empowered if you cultivate some of the attributes or some of the characteristics of a psychopath.
Context of White Supremacy, Gus T Renegade in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the system of white supremacy. Today's date, Friday, November 17th, 2017. So I have been told. This is our debut study session on Kevin Dutton's The Wisdom of Psychopaths. The full title, Lessons in Life from Saints, Spies, and Serial Killers. Man, oh man, we have been waiting for a while to get to this book. That was Dr. Niyana Rasayon. He was on the broadcast. That was his 5th visit, I believe, in 2013. When I said years ago, long time ago, I think it was 2012, actually, when he first referenced that book, much like Dr. Tommy Curry mentioning Delectable Negro. I think this year we at least have been able to scratch some of the books that have been hanging out on the book club list for a while. That would be 2 recommended by 2 of our favorite guests. In fact, I think Dr. Rasayon came back on again later and referenced that book again. But will be great to read. And I think the timing with this president in the White House and the shootings that have taken place and the allegations of sexual misconduct cropping up every day, great time to read the text. And I think, or at least I hope, that with the text that we just read, Neil Postman, about paying attention to words, we can be even more alert to words that are being used in this text. Without further ado, this is Kevin Dutton, White Man. The Wisdom of Psychopaths, Lessons in Life from Saints, Spies, and Serial Killers. Context of White Supremacy, audio segment number 1.
Macmillan Audio presents The Wisdom of Psychopaths, What Saints, Spies, and Serial Killers Can Teach About Success, by Kevin Dutton. Read for you by Eric Bergman. Preface. My father was a psychopath. It seems a bit odd saying that now, looking back, but he was, no question. He was charming, fearless, ruthless, but never violent. And he had about as much going on in the conscience department as a Jeffrey Dahmer cool box. He didn't kill anyone, but he certainly made a few killings. It's a good thing genes aren't everything, right? My father also had an uncanny knack for getting exactly what he wanted, often with just a casual throwaway line or a single telling gesture. People used to say that he looked like the scheming Del Boy in Only Fools and Horses, which he did, not just acted like him, which he also did. He too was a market trader. The BBC sitcom could have been a Dutton family video. I once remembered helping Dad sell a load of date books at Petticoat Lane Market in London's East End. I was 10 at the time, and it was a school day. The date books in question were a collector's item. They only had 11 months. You can't sell these, I protested. There's no January. I know, he said. That's why I forgot your birthday. Unique opportunity to get your hands on an 11-month diary, folks. Sign up for a special 2-for-1 offer and get an extra month thrown in next year for free. We unloaded the bloody lot. I've always maintained that Dad was in possession of pretty much the ideal personality for modern living. I never once saw him panic, never once saw him lose his cool, never once saw him get hot under the collar about anything. And believe me, there were plenty of times when he might have. They say that humans developed fear as a survival mechanism to protect against predators, he once told me. But you don't see too many saber-toothed tigers prowling round Elephant and Castle, now do you, boy? He was right. I certainly hadn't seen any. There were a few snakes, maybe, but everyone knew who they were. For a long time growing up, I used to think of Dad's bon mot as just another of his market stall one-liners. Here today, gone tomorrow. A bit like a lot of the crap he used to sell, funnily enough. But now, years later, I realize that there was actually a deep biological truth to what the crafty old bugger was saying. In fact, he anticipated the position taken by modern evolutionary psychologists with uncanny, sublime precision. We humans, it appears, did indeed develop our fear response as a survival mechanism to protect against predators. Monkeys with lesions of the amygdala, for instance, the brain's emotional sorting office, do very stupid things, like trying to pick up cobras. But millions of years on, in a world where wild animals aren't lurking around every street corner, this fear system can be oversensitive, like a nervous driver with their foot hovering constantly over the brake pedal, reacting to dangers that don't actually exist, and pushing us into making illogical, irrational choices. There was no such thing as stock in the Pleistocene era, George Lowenstein, professor of economics and psychology at Carnegie Mellon, points out. But human beings are pathologically risk-averse. A lot of the mechanisms that drive our emotions aren't really that well adapted to modern life. I prefer my dad's version. The observation that modern-day humans are pathologically risk-averse does not, needless to say, mean that this has always been the case. In fact, it might even be argued that those of us today who are clinically risk-averse, those of us, for instance, who suffer from chronic anxiety, simply have too much of a good thing. During the time of our ancestors, the existence of individuals who are hypervigilant to threat may well, evolutionary biologists suggest, have been decisive in the fight against predators. And from this point of view, anxiety would undoubtedly have served as a considerable adaptive advantage. The more sensitive you were to rustlings in the undergrowth, the more likely you'd have been to have kept yourself, your family, and your extended group members alive. Even today, anxious individuals are better than the rest of us at detecting the presence of threat. Slip an angry face in among a display of happy or neutral faces on a computer screen, and anxious people are far faster at picking it out than those who are non-anxious. Not a bad ability to fall back on should you happen to find yourself alone at night and wandering around an unfamiliar neighborhood. Being anxious can sometimes be useful. The notion that mental disorder can occasionally come in handy, conferring extraordinary, outlandish advantages as well as inordinate distress on its sufferers, is hardly new, of course. As the philosopher Aristotle observed more than 2,400 years ago, there was never a genius without a tincture of madness. In most people's minds, this link between genius and madness is probably most apparent thanks to the box office success of the films Rain Man and A Beautiful Mind when it comes to autism and schizophrenia. In his book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, the neurologist and psychiatrist Oliver Sacks reports a famous encounter with the twins. Profoundly autistic, John and Michael, then 26, were living in an institution. When a box of matches spilled onto the floor, both of them simultaneously called out, 111. As Sacks gathered up the matches, he started counting. On a similar note, the well-worn stereotype of the brilliant, tortured artist is also not without foundation. The painter Vincent van Gogh, the dancer Václav Nijinsky, and the father of game theory, of which more later, John Nash, were all psychotic. Coincidence? Not according to Szabolcs Kary, a researcher at Semmelweis University in Budapest, who appears to have uncovered a genetic polymorphism associated with both schizophrenia and creativity. Kary has found that people with 2 copies of a particular single-letter DNA variation in a gene called neuroguelin-1, a variation that has been previously linked to psychosis, as well as poor memory and sensitivity to criticism, tend to score significantly higher on measures of creativity compared with individuals who have 1 or no copy of the variation. Those with 1 copy also tend to be more creative, on average, than those without. Even depression has its advantages. Recent research suggests that despondency helps us think better and contributes to increased attentiveness and enhanced problem-solving ability. In an ingenious experiment, Joe Forgas, professor of psychology at the University of New South Wales, placed a variety of trinkets, such as toy soldiers, plastic animals, and miniature cars, near the checkout of a small stationery store in Sydney. As shoppers made their way out, Forgas tested their memory, asking them to list as many of the items as possible. But there was a catch. On some days, the weather was rainy, and Forgas piped Verdi's Requiem through the store. On other days, it was sunny, and shoppers were treated to a blast of Gilbert and Sullivan. The results couldn't have been clearer. Shoppers in the low-mood condition remembered nearly 4 times as many of the knickknacks. The rain made them sad, and their sadness made them pay more attention. Moral of the story: when the weather's nice, be sure to check your change. When you go down the road of disorders conferring advantages of clouds, silver linings, and psychological consolation prizes, it's difficult to conceive of a condition that doesn't pay off, at least in some form or another. Obsessive-compulsive? You're never going to leave the gas on. Paranoid? You'll never fall afoul of the small print. In fact, fear and sadness, anxiety and depression, constitute 2 of the 5 basic emotions that are found universally across cultures, and that, as such, virtually all of us experience at some point in our lives. But there's one group of people who are the exception to the rule, who don't experience either, even under the most difficult and trying of circumstances. Psychopaths. A psychopath wouldn't worry even if he had left the gas on. Any silver linings there? Put this question to a psychopath, and more often than not, he'll look at you as if you're the one who's crazy. To a psychopath, you see, there are no such things as clouds. There are only silver linings. The fiendish observation that a year consists of 12 months, not 11, might well have put one hell of a kibosh on selling those date books, you'd think. But not to my dad, it didn't. Quite the reverse, in fact. He saw it as a selling point. He's certainly not alone. Nor, some might argue, is he too far off the mark. During the course of my research, I've met a great many psychopaths from all walks of life, not just within my own family. Sure, behind closed doors, I've encountered my fair share of Hannibal Lecters and Ted Bundys, remorseless, unconscionable A-listers who could dine at any psychopath table you care to mention without even picking up the phone, by just showing up. But I've also met psychopaths who, far from devouring society from within, serve through nerveless poise and hard-as-nails decision-making to protect and enrich it instead. Surgeons, soldiers, spies, entrepreneurs, dare I say, even lawyers. Don't get too cocky. No matter how good you are, don't let them see you coming, counseled Al Pacino as the head attorney of a top law firm in the film The Devil's Advocate. That's the gaffe, my friend. Make yourself small. Be the hick, the cripple, the nerd, the leper, the freak. Look at me. I've been underestimated from day one. Pacino was playing the devil. And, not surprisingly perhaps, he hit the nail right on the head. If there's one thing that psychopaths have in common, it's the consummate ability to pass themselves off as normal, everyday folk, while behind the facade, the brutal, brilliant disguise beats the refrigerated heart of a ruthless, glacial predator. As one hugely successful young attorney told me on the balcony of his penthouse apartment overlooking the Thames, "Deep inside me there's a serial killer lurking somewhere, but I keep him amused with cocaine, Formula One, booty calls, and coruscating cross-examination." Ever so slowly, I moved away from the edge. This aerial encounter with the young lawyer, he later ran me back to my hotel downriver in his speedboat, goes some way toward illustrating a theory I have about psychopaths, that one of the reasons we're so fascinated by them is because we're fascinated by illusions, by things that appear on the surface to be normal, yet that on closer examination turn out to be anything but. Amasia lineatypus is a species of arachnid that mimics the physical appearance of the ants on which it preys. Only when it's too late are its victims finally disabused of the notion that they're good judges of character. Many people I've interviewed know exactly how that feels, and they, believe me, are the lucky ones. This is what psychopaths are like. Outwardly personable, they use their charm, charisma, and seamless psychological camouflage to distract us from their true colors, the latent anomaly right in front of our eyes. Their intoxicating, hypnotic presence draws us inexorably in. Yet psychopathy, as the devil and his flamboyant London protege just hinted, can also be good for us, at least in moderation. Like anxiety, depression, and quite a few other psychological disorders, it can at times be adaptive. Psychopaths, as we shall discover, have a variety of attributes, personal magnetism and a genius for disguise being just the starter pack, which, once you know how to harness them and keep them in check, often confer considerable advantages, not just in the workplace, but in everyday life. Psychopathy is like sunshine. Overexposure can hasten one's demise in grotesque, carcinogenic fashion. But regulated exposure at controlled and optimal levels can have a significant positive impact on well-being and quality of life. In the pages that follow, we'll examine these attributes in detail and learn how incorporating them into our own psychological skill set can dramatically transform our lives. Of course, it's in no way my intention to glamorize the actions of psychopaths, certainly not the actions of dysfunctional psychopaths anyway. That would be like glamorizing a cognitive melanoma, the malignant machinations of cancer of the personality. But there's evidence to suggest that psychopathy, in small doses at least, is personality with a tan, and that it can have surprising benefits. I've witnessed a few firsthand. As the years rolled by and he retired from the markets, the gods didn't look too favorably on Dad, though it wasn't as if he was picky. Figurines of Buddhas, Mohammeds, Sacred Hearts, Virgin Marys, they'd all done their time in the back of his three-wheeler van. He got Parkinson's and went, in a frighteningly short space of time, from someone who could pack up a suitcase in 10 seconds flat, an ability that had come in handy surprisingly often, to someone who couldn't even stand without an aid on either arm. In the old days, they used to be cops, he would say. But his finest moment undoubtedly occurred posthumously. At least, it was after he died that it came to my attention. One evening, not long after the funeral, I was going through his things when I came upon a volume of handwritten notes in a drawer. The notes had been penned by a succession of the various caregivers who had looked after Dad over the previous few months. He'd managed, against the advice of pretty much everyone, to stick it out at home, and amounted, I suppose, to a kind of care diary. The first thing that struck me about the diary, I remember, was how neat and painstakingly detailed the entries were. Unmistakably female, the handwriting catwalked voluptuously across the page, modestly attired in blue or black bick, with barely a serif or ligature out of place. But the more I read, the more it dawned on me just how little variety there had been in Dad's last few months. How monotonous, repetitive, and unremittingly bleak that final pitch, that final stand-on in the market stall of life must have been. Not that he'd ever given me that impression when I dropped in to visit him, of course. The Parkinsons may well have been kicking the shit out of his arms and legs, but it was no match for his spirit. Yet the reality of the situation was clear. Got Mr. Dutton out of bed at 7:30. Gave Mr. Dutton a shave, made Mr. Dutton a cucumber sandwich, brought Mr. Dutton a cup of tea, and so on, and so forth, ad infinitum. Pretty soon I started to get bored, and as one does, began randomly fanning through the pages. Then something caught my eye. In tremulous, spidery writing, scrawled in large block capitals across the middle of one of the pages, was the following. Mr. Dutton did cartwheels down the hall, followed a couple of pages later by Mr. Dutton performed a strip show on the balcony. Something told me he might be making it up. But hey, this was Dad we were talking about. Why mess with the habit of a lifetime? Besides, the rules of the game had changed. Behind the cut-price bullshit lurked a higher, greater truth. The story of a man whose soul was under fire, whose circuits and synapses were hopelessly and mercilessly outgunned, but who, when the chips were down and the game was all but up, was going down fighting in a hail of irrepressible irreverence. Cartwheels and strip shows beat shaves and cucumber sandwiches any day of the week. Who cared if it was crap? The wisdom of psychopaths. Chapter 1. Scorpio Rising. A scorpion and a frog are sitting on the bank of a river, and both need to get to the other side. "Hello, Mr. Frog," calls the scorpion through the reeds. "Would you be so kind as to give me a ride on your back across the water? I have important business to conduct on the other side, and I cannot swim in such a strong current." The frog immediately becomes suspicious. "Well, Mr. Scorpion," he replies, "I appreciate the fact that you have important business to conduct on the other side of the river, but just take a moment to consider your request. You are a scorpion. You have a large stinger at the end of your tail. As soon as I let you onto my back, it is entirely within your nature to sting me." The scorpion, who had anticipated the frog's objections, counters thus. "My dear Mr. Frog, your reservations are perfectly reasonable, but it is clearly not in my interest to sting you. I really do need to get to the other side of the river, and I give you my word that no harm will come to you." The frog agrees, reluctantly, that the scorpion has a point, so he allows the fast-talking scorpion to scramble atop his back and hops, without further ado, into the water. At first, all is well. Everything goes exactly according to plan. But halfway across, the frog suddenly feels a sharp pain in his back and sees, out of the corner of his eye, the scorpion withdraw the stinger from his hide. A deadening numbness begins to creep into his limbs. "You fool!" croaks the frog. "You said you needed to get to the other side to conduct your business. Now we are both going to die." The scorpion shrugs and does a little jig on the drowning frog's back. "Mr. Frog," he replies casually, "you said it yourself. I am a scorpion. It is in my nature to sting you." With that, the scorpion and the frog both disappear beneath the murky, muddy waters of the swiftly flowing current, and neither of them is seen again. Bottom line. During his trial in 1980, John Wayne Gacy declared with a sigh that all he was really guilty of was running a cemetery without a license. It was quite a cemetery. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy had raped and murdered at least 33 young men and boys, with an average age of about 18, before stuffing them into a crawl space beneath his house. One of his victims, Robert Donnelly, survived Gacy's attentions, but was tortured so mercilessly by his captor that at several points during his ordeal he begged Gacy to get it over with and kill him. Gacy was bemused. "I'm getting around to it," he replied. I have cradled John Wayne Gacy's brain in my hands. Following his execution in 1994 by lethal injection, Dr. Helen Morrison, a witness for the defense at his trial and one of the world's leading experts on serial killers, had assisted in his autopsy in a Chicago hospital and then driven back home with his brain jiggling around in a glass jar on the passenger seat of her Buick. She'd wanted to find out whether there was anything about it, lesions, tumors, disease, that made it different from the brains of normal people. Tests revealed nothing unusual. Several years later, over coffee in her office in Chicago, I got to chatting with Dr. Morrison about the significance of her findings, the significance of finding nothing. "Does this mean," I asked her, "that we're basically all psychopaths deep down? That each of us harbors the propensity to rape, kill, and torture? If there's no difference between my brain and the brain of John Wayne Gacy, then where precisely does the difference lie?" Morrison hesitated before highlighting one of the most fundamental truths in neuroscience. "A dead brain is very different from a living one," she said. "Outwardly, one brain may look very similar to another, but function completely differently. It's what happens when the lights are on, not off, that tips the balance." Gacy was such an extreme case that I wondered whether there might be something else contributing to his actions, some injury or damage to his brain, or some anatomical anomaly. But there wasn't. It was normal. Which just goes to show how complex and impenetrable the brain can be sometimes, how reluctant it is to give up its secrets, how differences in upbringing, say, or other random experiences can cause subtle changes in internal wiring and chemistry, which then account for tectonic shifts in behavior. Morrison's talk that day of lights and tectonic shifts reminded me of a rumor I once got wind of about Robert Hare, professor of psychology at the University of British Columbia and one of the world's leading authorities on psychopaths. Back in the 1990s, Hare submitted a research paper to an academic journal that included the EEG responses of both psychopaths and non-psychopaths as they performed what's known as a lexical decision task. Hare and his team of co-authors showed volunteers a series of letter strings and then got them to decide as quickly as possible whether or not those strings comprised a word. What they found was astonishing. Whereas normal participants identified emotionally charged words like CANCER or RAPE more quickly than neutral words like TREE or PLATE, this wasn't the case with psychopaths. To the psychopaths, emotion was irrelevant. The journal rejected the paper. Not, it turned out, for its conclusions, but for something even more extraordinary. Some of the EEG patterns, reviewers alleged, were so abnormal they couldn't possibly have come from real people. But of course, they had. Intrigued by my talk with Morrison in Chicago about the mysteries and enigmas of the psychopathic mind, indeed about neural recalcitrance in general, I visited Hare in Vancouver. Was the rumor true? I asked him. Had the paper really been rejected? If so, what was going on? There are 4 different kinds of brain waves, he told me, ranging from beta waves during periods of high alertness through alpha and theta waves to delta waves which accompany deep sleep. These waves reflect the fluctuating levels of electrical activity in the brain at various times. In normal members of the population, theta waves are associated with drowsy, meditative, or sleeping states. In psychopaths, they occur during normal waking states, even sometimes during states of increased arousal. Language for psychopaths is only word deep. There is no emotional contouring behind it. A psychopath may say something like, "I love you," but in reality, it means about as much to him as if he said, "I'll have a cup of coffee." This is one of the reasons why psychopaths remain so cool, calm, and collected under conditions of extreme danger, and why they are so reward-driven and take risks. Their brains, quite literally, are less switched on than the rest of ours. I thought back to Gacy and what I'd learned from Dr. Morrison. "Kiss my ass," he'd said as he entered the death chamber. Normal on the outside, Gacy was a pillar of his local community, and on one occasion was even photographed with First Lady Rosalind Carter. He camouflaged his inner scorpion with an endearing cloak of charm. But it was entirely in his nature to sting you, as much as it was to convince you that he wouldn't. Talking the walk. Fabricio Rossi is 35 years old and used to be a window cleaner. But his predilection for murder eventually got the better of him, and now, would you believe, he does it for a living. As we stand next to each other on a balmy spring morning, poking uneasily around John Wayne Gacy's bedroom, I ask him what the deal is. What is it about psychopaths that we find so irresistible? Why do they fascinate us so much? It's definitely not the first time he's been asked. "I think the main thing about psychopaths," says Rossi, "is the fact that on the one hand they're so normal, so much like the rest of us, but on the other, so different. I mean, Gacy used to dress up as a clown and perform at children's parties. That's the thing about psychopaths. On the outside, they seem so ordinary, yet scratch beneath the surface, peek inside the crawl space, as it were, and you never know what you might find." We are not, of course, in Gacy's actual bedroom, but rather in a mocked-up version of it that comprises an exhibit in what must surely be a candidate for the grisliest museum in the world, the Museum of Serial Killers in Florence. The museum is located on Via Cavour, a well-heeled side street within screaming distance of the Duomo, and Fabricio Rossi curates it. The museum is doing well, and why wouldn't it? They're all here, if you're into that kind of thing. Everyone from Jack the Ripper to Jeffrey Dahmer, from Charles Manson to Ted Bundy. Bundy's an interesting case, I tell Rossi. An eerie portent of the psychopath's hidden powers, a tantalizing pointer to the possibility that, if you look hard enough, there might be more in the crawl space than just dark secrets. He's surprised, to say the least. "But Bundy is one of the most notorious serial killers in history," he says. "He's one of the museum's biggest attractions. Can there really be anything else except dark secrets?" There can. In 2009, 20 years after his execution at Florida State Prison, at the precise time that Bundy was being led to the electric chair, local radio stations urged listeners to turn off household appliances to maximize the power supply. Psychologist Angela Book and her colleagues at Brock University in Canada decided to take the icy American serial killer at his word. During interview, Bundy, who staved in the skulls of 35 women during a 4-year period in the mid-1970s, had claimed, with that boyish, all-American smile of his, that he could tell a good victim simply from the way she walked. "I'm the coldest son of a bitch you'll ever meet," Bundy enunciated, and no one can fault him there. But, Book wondered, might he also have been one of the shrewdest? To find out, she set up a simple experiment. First, she handed out the self-report psychopathy scale a questionnaire specifically designed to assess psychopathic traits within the general population, as opposed to within a prison or hospital setting, to 47 male undergraduate students. Then, based on the results, she divided them up into high and low scorers. Next, she videotaped the gait of 12 new participants as they walked down a corridor from one room to another, where they completed a standard demographics questionnaire. The questionnaire included 2 items. 1, have you ever been victimized in the past, yes or no? 2, if yes, how many times has such victimization occurred? Finally, Book presented the 12 videotaped segments to the original 47 participants and issued them a challenge. Rate, on a scale of 1 to 10, how vulnerable to being mugged each of the targets was. The rationale was simple. If Bundy's assertion held water and he really had been able to sniff out weakness from the way his victims walked, then, Book surmised, those who scored high on the self-report psychopathy scale should be better at judging vulnerability than the low scorers. That, it turned out, was exactly what she found. Moreover, when Book repeated the procedure with clinically diagnosed psychopaths from a maximum security prison, she found something else. The high-scoring psychopathic undergraduates in the first study might have been good at identifying weakness, but the clinical psychopaths went one better. They explicitly stated it was because of the way people walked. They, like Bundy, knew precisely what they were looking for. The men who stare at coats. Angela Book's findings are no flash in the pan. Here is one of a growing number of studies that have, in recent years, begun to show the psychopath in a new, more complex light. A light somewhat different from the lurid shadows cast by newspaper headlines and Hollywood scriptwriters. The news is difficult to swallow, and it goes down the same way here in this murderous little corner of Florence as it does nearly everywhere else, with a healthy dose of skepticism. "Do you mean," asks Fabricio, incredulous, "that there are times when it isn't necessarily a bad thing to be a psychopath?" "Not only that," I nod, "but there are times when it's actually a good thing, when, by being a psychopath, you in fact have an advantage over other people." Rossi seems far from convinced, and, looking around, it's easy to understand why. Bundy and Gacy aren't exactly the best crowd to fall in with. And, let's face it, when you've got several dozen others knocking about in the wings, it's difficult to see the positives. But the Museum of Serial Killers doesn't tell the full story. In fact, it's not the half of it. As Helen Morrison eloquently elucidated, the fate of a psychopath depends on a whole range of factors, including genes, family background, education, intelligence, and opportunity, and on how they interact. Jim Curry, vice president of the U.S. National Association of Chiefs of Police, makes a similar point. Traits that are common among psychopathic serial killers, Curry observes, a grandiose sense of self-worth, persuasiveness, superficial charm, ruthlessness, lack of remorse, and the manipulation of others, are also shared by politicians and world leaders, individuals running not from the police, but for office. Such a profile, notes Curry, allows those who present with it to do what they like when they like, completely unfazed by the social, moral, or legal consequences of their actions. If you are born under the right star, for example, and have power over the human mind as the moon over the sea, you might order the genocide of 100,000 Kurds and shuffle to the gallows with such arcane recalcitrance as to elicit from even your harshest detractors perverse, unspoken deference. "Do not be afraid, doctor," said Saddam Hussein on the scaffold moments before his execution. "This is for men." If you are violent and cunning, like real-life Hannibal Lecter Robert Maudsley, you might lure a fellow inmate to your cell, smash in his skull with a claw hammer, and sample his brains with a spoon as nonchalantly as if you were downing a soft-boiled egg. Maudsley, by the way, has been cooped up in solitary confinement for the past 30 years in a bulletproof cage in the basement of Wakefield Prison in England. Or, if you are a brilliant neurosurgeon, ruthlessly cool and focused under pressure, you might, like James Garrity, try your luck on a completely different playing field, at the remote outposts of 21st century medicine, where risk blows in on 100-mile-an-hour winds, and the oxygen of deliberation is thin. I have no compassion for those whom I operate on, he told me. That is a luxury I simply cannot afford. In the theater, I am reborn, as a cold, heartless machine, totally at one with scalpel, drill, and saw. When you're cutting loose and cheating death high above the snow line of the brain, feelings aren't fit for purpose. Emotion is entropy and seriously bad for business. I've hunted it down to extinction over the years. Garrity is one of the UK's top neurosurgeons, and though on one level his words send a chill down the spine, on another they make perfect sense. Deep in the ghettos of some of the brain's most dangerous neighborhoods, the psychopath is glimpsed as a lone and ruthless predator, a solitary species of transient, deadly allure. No sooner is the word out than images of serial killers, rapists, and mad, reclusive bombers come stalking down the sidewalks of our minds. But what if I were to paint you a different picture? What if I were to tell you that the arsonist who burns your house down might also, in a parallel universe, be the hero most likely to brave the flaming timbers of a crumbling, blazing building to seek out and drag out your loved ones? Or that the kid with a knife in the shadows, the back of the movie theater, might well, in years to come, be wielding a rather different kind of knife at the back of a rather different kind of theater? Claims like these are admittedly hard to believe, but they're true. Psychopaths are fearless, confident, charismatic, ruthless, and focused. Yet, contrary to popular belief, they are not necessarily violent. And if that sounds good, well, it is. Or rather, it can be. It depends, as we've just seen, on what else you've got lurking on the shelves of your personality cupboard. Far from its being an open and shut case, you're either a psychopath or you're not, there are instead inner and outer zones of the disorder, a bit like the fare zones on a subway map. As we shall see in Chapter 2, there is a spectrum of psychopathy along which each of us has our place, with only a small minority of A-listers resident in the inner city. One individual, for example, may be ice-cold under pressure and display about as much empathy as an avalanche. We'll be meeting some like this on the trading floor later, and yet at the same time act neither violently nor antisocially, nor without conscience. Scoring high on two psychopathic attributes, such an individual might rightly be considered further along the psychopathic spectrum than someone scoring lower on that dyad of traits, yet still not be anywhere near the Chianti-swilling danger zone of a person scoring high on all of them. Just as there's no official dividing line between someone who plays recreational golf on the weekends and, say, Tiger Woods, so the boundary between a world-class, hole-in-one super psychopath and one who merely psychopathizes is similarly blurred. Think of psychopathic traits as the dials and sliders on a studio mixing desk. If you push all of them to max, you'll have a soundtrack that's no use to anyone. But if the soundtrack is graded and some controls are turned up higher than others, such as fearlessness, focus, lack of empathy, and mental toughness, for example, you may well have a surgeon who's a cut above the rest. Of course, surgery is just one instance where psychopathic talent may prove beneficial. There are others. Take law enforcement, for example. In 2009, shortly after Angela Book published the results of her study, I decided to perform my own take on it. If, as she'd found, psychopaths really were better at decoding vulnerability, then there had to be applications. There had to be ways in which, rather than being a drain on society, this talent conferred some advantage. Enlightenment dawned when I met a friend at the airport. We all get a bit paranoid going through customs, I mused, even when we're perfectly innocent. But imagine what it would feel like if we did have something to hide. 30 undergraduate students took part in my experiment, half of whom had scored high on the self-report psychopathy scale, the other half low. There were also 5 associates. The students' job was easy. They had to sit in a classroom and observe the associates' movements as they entered through one door and exited through another, traversing en route a small elevated stage. But there was a catch. The students also had to note who was guilty, which of the 5 was concealing a scarlet handkerchief. To raise the stakes and give the students something to go on, the guilty associate was handed 100 pounds. If the jury correctly identified the guilty party, if, when the votes were counted, the person with the handkerchief came out on top, then they had to give the money back. If, on the other hand, they got away with it, and the finger of suspicion fell more heavily on one of the others, then the guilty associate would stand to be rewarded. They would keep the 100 pounds. The nerves were certainly jangling when the associates made their entrance. But which of the students would make the better customs officers? Would the psychopath's predatory instincts prove reliable? Or would their nose for vulnerability let them down? The results were extraordinary. Over 70% of those who scored high on the self-report psychopathy scale correctly picked out the handkerchief smuggling associate, compared to just 30% of the low scorers. Zeroing in on weakness may well be part of a serial killer's toolkit, but it may also come in handy at the airport.
Context of White Supremacy. First audio segment is complete. We will pick up the subtitle word, the next chapter, Psychopath Radar. Just with that chapter name alone, I've not read this book before. This is my first time with folks that are listening in. With what I've heard in the first portion of the book, could be threatening Gus's top 10 book list. Thoroughly enjoyed. We'll have to see. It has to be great from beginning to end to even, make me consider adjusting the list. But I have thoroughly enjoyed the first segment and looking forward to hearing thoughts from listeners in case I'm just crazy and have been seduced by some psychobabble buckets of words. The number to dial, 641-715-3640. The code 564-943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. Actually, *61. Number again, 641-715-3640. The code 564-943#. Press *61 if you would like to participate. If you want to join in, but you do not want to use your phone, you can use the free HD line, or the Vote line, you can use the Vote line. It's linked at Black Talk Radio Network. If you need the address, it is tiny, tiny.cc/1race, and that is the number 1. Address again, tiny, tiny.cc/1race, and that is the number 1. When you enter that address, look on the left. You'll see the link for the free Vote line. Click the link. It will open a small window on your screen. First line is a drop-down menu. Select the number I just gave out, which again is 641-715-3640. Next line, it will ask for the code. That code again is 564943. Final line, it will ask for a name. You can enter a real name, nickname, press random keys, whatever you're comfortable with. Once you get all that entered, click the green button at the bottom. It will connect you to the live broadcast. You should be able to hear us. Same procedure if you would like to participate. You will see the dial pad on your screen. Press *61. We'll see your hand on the switchboard and we will get you on the line. Thought, kind of in addition to whatever thoughts, questions you have about the first portion of The Wisdom of Psychopaths, I was going to mention this with Neil Postman's book. With the previous book, I had both a digital copy and a hard copy. I did not read the physical copy at all. I just read the hard copy the entire time and put my notes there. For this book, I only have the digital copy. Do you have an opinion, the difference between the two? I know we've had guests on before who said that they are not a fan of all of this becoming digital for a variety of reasons. Just the tangible feel of having a book, an organic book in your hand, and other items, other reasons rather. I think some of it also was they felt that there would probably be a lot of black authors, a lot of non-white authors, works like the ISIS Papers, Urugu, Amos Wilson, that a lot of those works probably would not be digitized, and the authors would not be compensated, even if that material does become digitized. You have ebooks and such, that the funds would not end up going to them or their family so they could reap the benefits of that financially. But if folks have any thoughts on ebook, hard copy, you want to add that in as we proceed. Anywho, we'll hit the phone lines. If you have comments, thoughts, questions, lines should be open. Proceed.
May I be heard?
Greetings, Red in Nevada.
Hello. Thank you for taking my call. I definitely enjoy this book. I used to read extensively about serial killers, so it definitely has piqued my interest. The first note that I took was about the calendar story. I kind of thought that was interesting how he kind of downplayed the fact that he's at first admitting that he first feels like his father is a psychopath, and he kind of uses the fact that, oh, well, he could sell, 11-month calendars as a way of just kind of saying, well, this is how he's similar to a psychopath. But then later on, he uses the example for Tiger Woods, saying that he's almost he's a psychopath when it comes to golf because he's so good, and also at the same time comparing him to, he said Tiger Woods was a world-class hole-in-one super psychopath, but then also comparing him to somebody who just plays golf on the weekend. So it almost seems like he's downplaying, I guess, Tiger Woods' abilities. The other thing was that I thought maybe he could be practicing confusion or racism by mainly using examples of white people who were born in the USA. The serial killers here and not the serial killers in the UK. For instance, one of the first ones he spoke about was Jeffrey Dahmer, and there was actually a serial killer. His name was Dennis Nielsen, and he was referred to as the United Kingdom type of Jeffrey Dahmer. Basically did the same thing, killed young males, and ate them. So I thought that was kind of weird. It almost seemed like, how people would then say, well, oh, there's only racism only in the South. The last thing, or I guess a couple other things, I thought it was interesting, his example of how a psychopath would say, would compare I love you is basically the same as having a cup of coffee, as Ms. Ben talked about on the show, saying, a cup of Joe and then old Black Joe. That kind of brought up a Welsing moment for me. And the part on page 10, when he was comparing he said something about, and I actually do have the book, and I definitely think that it's better to have the book, but he had said, deep in the ghettos of some of the brain's most dangerous neighborhoods, the psychopath is glimpsed as a lone and ruthless predator. And I thought that was definitely in practicing racism. Not only, he's referring to ghettos, and I know that in Europe, ghettos were first, or I guess they looked at the ghettos as far as being affiliated with World War II, where Jewish people were herded into. But I looked at that as a different way as far as the ghettos here and how, mainly non-white people are herded into ghettos and how that's thought of being a bad thing. That's all I wanted to share for now. Thank you for allowing me to speak.
Awesome. Great analysis on Tiger Woods. And I just want to add, I am mega offended. We could have been reading this while we had to suffer through Frantz Fanon. I'm just continuing to get my indictment in since I had to sit through that. And I was so offended every day. I knew it was going to be horrible, and it absolutely was for me, in spite of folks who thought it was of some constructive value. But that's what I mean. Like, that should be thought about when people, in my view, reference Fanon. Oh, you got to read it. That's the most important book out there. Just compare that with some of the other things you've read and then weigh that. What does that mean about what's being said in terms of what's important to read to get an accurate understanding of what racism is, how it works. Other folks have comments?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, sir, Mr. Demery Ford.
Greetings, Gus. Greetings to the female caller and all the other listeners. I, too, will start with his father being a psychopath. And I thought about that for a minute, and I'm thinking, if you were closely related to a psychopath and you had to endure his behavior and his mannerisms for years and years, there may be, a chance that you may also be a psychopath. He said that he never saw his father lose his cool, so that's one of the attributes of a psychopath. And his father, when he was talking about the way his father spoke, using bon mot, or I had to look that up, so it's like clever sayings or witty little mottos, aphorisms. That was to, later on he talked about how humans develop fear response as a survival mechanism to protect against predators. So I guess him using those little witty bon mots was to disguise, the really things that was going on in his mind. He couldn't have felt normal if he was a real psychopath, and then half of his time would be spent trying to fool others. And so I thought about the difference in a psychopath and a sociopath. And he talked about in the book the ability to not only not show emotions, but the lack of any of the 5 emotions: fear, sadness, anger, happiness, and disgust. So normal people feel these emotions, and a psychopath doesn't. They don't even feel the emotion, but then I guess they can fake with the set of tool sets that they have what a normal person would do in these situations. He mentioned Hannibal Lecter, Ted Bundy, and the real life Hannibal Lecter, Robert Mausley, and he's cooped up in a solitary confinement in Wakefield Prison in England. So I guess most of his atrocities were in Europe. He mentioned also Ted Bundy. Let's see, was it Ted? No, John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy was a pillar of his community. And I know about this John Wayne Gacy. I read a lot about him. I think it probably would have been better if he had said John Wayne Gacy seemed to be a pillar of the community. You know, they're master deceivers. If he was a clown, imagine how classic that is. Now, this guy can dress up as a clown, go to kids' parties, and then take those same kids and rape and murder them and bury them under his house. At the same time, well, yeah, probably the same time he was doing this, he was married, and he had 2 kids. So then he had the rest of the community fool that he was this decent guy, when in actuality he was a psychopath, serial killer. And the book mentioned that sometimes I guess you could psychopathic talents or personalities can serve people well. And then he mentioned that in small amounts, it would be like a personality with a tan. So I picked that up, and from the last book, we're starting to get hypersensitive on these things, the way these white authors cleverly use of words and how they use references and examples. Like the first caller said, he used Tiger Woods. He was trying to make a point that there's no official difference between a recreational golfer and Tiger Woods. But, that doesn't even hold water either, because Tiger Woods is, if there is a such thing as a golfer Hall of Fame, he'll surely be in it. All the green jackets that he has, he was at one time the greatest golfer in the world. They even designed golf courses, to make it harder for him at one time. So, bad use of an example there at the very least. And I guess the author himself, first let me say this is a preface. In the preface on 15, I guess Roman number 15, if there's one thing that psychopaths have in common, it's the consummate ability to pass themselves off as normal everyday folk, while behind the facade, the brutal, brilliant disguise beats the refrigerated heart of a ruthless, glacial predator. And I think that about sums it up for white people, the way white people operate. You got this facade, and non-white people, especially black people, fall for this all the time, this disguise. And they can't understand that deep inside this individual there's a refrigerated heart. And they do not care. They cannot even feel emotion. Don't try to prove to white people that you have humanity when they don't even have the ability to show emotions and any aspects of humanity. And then let me get to this experiment that I assume, I could be incorrect, but it looked like Mr. Dutton himself conducted this experiment after there was a similar experiment with 70-some people. He did an experiment with 30 undergrads, I guess on a self-report psychopathic scale. They scored these individuals. Half of them scored high, half of them low. Then he put 5 associates with him to walk in and out of a door, and gave them a handkerchief and some type of incentive to have them to fool the people that are watching them. Give them some incentive to be, clever in that. Don't give yourself away. But then those that scored high on the psychopathic scale, over 70% of them picked the guy out correctly. And I guess 30% of the ones that scored low, but in the end, zeroing in on a weakness may well be a part of a serial killer's toolkit. And I think that that's part of a racist toolkit also, because they can zoom in on some weakness, and that's why we should be vigilant about our counter-racist tactics and strategies and our codified manners of behavior. I'll mute my line for now. Give somebody else a chance. Thanks for taking the call, Gus.
Can I be heard?
Appreciate that, Mr. Demifor. Yes, sir. I think this is Rob in Wisconsin. Yes, sir. We can hear you.
That would be correct. Greetings.
Greetings.
Greetings to every other callers on the line. Very briefly, I was amazed at just the introduction. And what really stood out to me was the story about the frog and the scorpion. And the scorpion, the frog, even though the frog knew the nature of the scorpion, the frog still gave in and gave the scorpion the ride, and it ended in death. And I think that is very likened to the relationship between people who classify themselves as white and non-white people. Even though the people that classify themselves as white has this murderous, treacherous history, we still end up being the frog in this situation. And that's all I have for now. Thank you.
Appreciate.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Appreciate that, Rob in Wisconsin. Yes, sir. We can hear you, Roz.
Oh, no problem. Greetings. Thank you. Greetings to you guys, to Rob, Mr. Demley, for Red, and everyone else who called in and is listening. First, I wanted to say, I know in Britain, they recently started to ban digital books because it's been causing damage to the eyes of people who read them. It has to do, I think, with the light and then the fact that it's so close to the face. But I remember reading an article and actually discussing it this past summer about that, where people are like moving away from the digitized books. Me personally, I prefer a hard copy book. Reason why is because the digital things and the fact that white people are treacherous and they're liars, they could doctor those books anytime and you would not be aware that they did. Whereas with a hard copy text, if there are any changes made to the book, then it usually goes into different editions. It'll be second edition, so on and so forth. So anytime there's changes made, it's updated, and it goes through a more official process of updating the text, and it's less easy to doctor something in a hard copy form. So for me personally, I would stick with the hard copy over the digital, just to answer your question on that. I thought Mr. Demy's speaking on him using that, speaking about but he says, but there's evidence to suggest that psychopathy in small doses at least is a personality with a 10, and it can have surprising benefits. To me, that was definitely a Dr. Welsing moment. That's something that stood out to me immediately. I was highlighting throughout the text, and I think you're right. It might be in my top 10 too, because I have studied psychopathy, sociopathy, and I've discussed it before. And this book is just very, very great as far as the beginning. Even though, of course, he's a racist practicing racism throughout it as well. What I found was that in him using the term tan, of course, he's implying that it's adding color. It's saying it's a personality with color being a tan indicative of being black, and basically speaking to the fact that being able to tan is a beneficial thing, because he said it has benefits. So it's like a double entendre in a white supremacist fashion. So like I said, he's going to be practicing racism. I'm going to continue to watch that. And to me, just the beginning of this text really elucidates why I've come to the conclusion that racism, white supremacy is a functional mental illness that consists of psychopathy, sociopathy, acute narcissism, with an intense understanding and terror of genetic annihilation. That I've been saying it for a few years now because that has been my conclusion, and this book is further bringing that conclusion to even more fruition as far as the breadth of understanding. When he wrote on page 14, he wrote, when you go down the road of disorders conferring advantages of clouds, silver linings, and psychological consolation prizes, it's difficult to conceive of a condition that doesn't pay off, at least in some form or another. Obsessive compulsive, you're never going to leave the gas on. Paranoid, you'll never fall afoul of the small print. In fact, fear and sadness, anxiety and depression constitute 2 of the 5 basic emotions that are found universally across cultures, and that as such, virtually all of us experience at some point in our lives, but there is one group of people who are the exception to the rule, who don't experience either, even under the most difficult and trying of circumstances. Psychopaths. A psychopath wouldn't worry if he left the gas on. Any silver linings there? Now, what I find very important about this is white people normalizing the abnormal. They're giving you all these different illnesses and telling you that they all have a different advantage. And this is based on white people's perception. Now, remember the origin of psychiatry, biological psychiatry, remains on the African continent, specifically the Nile Valley. Dr. Richard King wrote an incredible treatise on that. So the illnesses that we see today that even he's discussing are not illnesses that were inherent in our people. That's why our societies were balanced. That's why we didn't have a word for jail or orphanage or old folks home, because we actually took care of our people. So he's normalizing the abnormal, and it kind of brings me even to the whole concept of anti-sexuality, this whole transgender thing that's going on. There's a term that I came across called body integrity identity disorder. And if you look it up, there's great information on it, but they're basically saying that people who are anti-sexual have a body integrity disorder, where they have one sex organ, but they think or see themselves as having another. That is a mental illness. And what are they doing? They're trying to normalize it. They're making all these laws. You got to have transgender bathrooms and all of this other stuff. In Canada, they're saying if a child says that they're transgender and the parent refuses to call them by the gender that they would like, that the court can take the child from the house. This is in Canada. Just read about that a couple months ago. So again, that paragraph, normalizing the abnormal and trying to make white behavior something that's applicable to everyone, not being applicable to everyone in the context of white supremacy, where these people are literally infesting their victims with severe mental illnesses that express themselves in the ways that we're learning about. I thought that Rob, when he brought up the scorpion and the frog, is exactly something I was going to talk about. It's that relationship that we have established with these people, in air quotes. I don't believe that they're people at all. But these hominids, where for some reason, because we come from a background that did not delve into or we had no fear or need to fear genetic annihilation, we're coming at life from a 180-degree different perspective than them. And because we have this, and we've always done this, we've had this ideology that everyone's the same, and we always try to endear ourselves to other people, other groups of all kinds, they're able to manipulate that aspect of us in stellar form to the point where we have not collectively come to an understanding of what the problem is first and how we're going to go about solving it. And that is the genius in them. And I've been watching this documentary. Actually, I'm watching it for the 3rd time now. It's called Dahmer on Dahmer. And it's about Jeffrey Dahmer speaking about himself. And everything this man is talking about is coming out in this documentary. And I can't wait to watch it for a 3rd time. But I suggest everybody on this line, check it out. It's called Dahmer on Dahmer. It's about 2 hours long. It's mind-blowing. And this book it'll give you even more insight. And you can see him in his own words practice psychopathy right there on the screen. I'll mute my line. Sorry I was so long-winded. I can't wait to talk more later. I'll mute myself.
Appreciate that, Roz. No apologies. Do we have any other folks who had a hand up that we've not heard from?
Can I be heard?
Yes, ma'am. Greetings, Emmy.
Greetings, everybody. To answer the question about ebooks versus paper books, I think there are pros and cons, and I really, I've typically been a person who needed print. I was very specific about that. But I've made a transition to digital, and so far I love it. It allows me to be more mobile. It allows me to have a higher productivity. like I can do more because I can carry more with me, and it's easier. I even actually do like the way that it feels. I think like if you, depending on what device you're using, you can even have a dictionary, which I think increases retention. Sometimes we may not comprehend something. I know for myself, like I love being able to click it, look it up real quick, whatever word I don't know, and then I get a better understanding. And I think it's just difficult if you have everything in print to do that. I think also that it could lead to a proliferation in maintaining the books also, and that those books getting spread so people would read more. More people have access and can thus read more. Also, I think like sometimes, like for instance, if it's a PDF, it's not an ebook. It was the original text, and now it's been like scanned in, so we do have that original text to kind of minimize any editing and stuff like that. Regarding some of the cons, like if non-white authors would get compensated or not, I can't speak for them. I don't know. But I wonder, like, I'd be curious to know, like, would they rather less people read the text? But, like, so let's say their book was, like, in an e-form, and then so many more non-white people read it because they were able to get it for free. Would they be upset if they weren't compensated? I'm not so sure. But anyway, one thing that I was thinking about while I was listening is there's, I think it's Audre Lorde, who has the quote that the master's house can't be dismantled with his tools or something. I know I'm like chopping it up. I could have Googled it to be more professional with that, but, and I disagree. And I understand, I disagree. So I took a couple of notes and see, like, I can actually do all of this because I'm doing it for the first time with the e-thing. So I feel like I'm so on point right now. Like, boom, here I am at my notes, and it's great. So I think that when the pages are different because I made the text larger so it was easier for me to see, but he talks about the monkeys having a lesion with the amygdala. I don't know which came first, this book or Django. I don't know, but I do remember in that film there was like a scene where Leonardo DiCaprio like takes the skull of a dead, like, enslaved person and says like things that, like, it was something about the amygdala and saying, you know, and I was just wondering, like, who picked it from who, or is this just some kind of like running joke or something that, you know, between white people? I just thought Django when I read that part. I think that there's a part where the quote from Devil's Advocate or whatever, that movie, and the quote begins with, "That's the gaff, my friend." I've played that. Okay, I'll just read it. "The cripple, the nerd, the leper, the freak, look at me. I've been underestimated," and it goes on. And, you know, back to the Audre Lorde quote, I think this is kind of might be what I'm talking about when I say wearing a mask. They're very effective at this. And I don't necessarily think that, I think there's room. We have the capacity, the mental capacity to be able to do some of the same things. And I think it might actually be a requirement, you know, not necessarily be like a scorpion on their back or whatever, not to use that metaphor, but to alter our behavior, to not be so transparent, because I think it makes us more vulnerable. Or there's enough evidence to suggest that that makes us more vulnerable. I also, too, thought personality with a tan. I put Welsing moment there. And I think there's, for me, it's page 19, but it's a quote where it was like, who cared if it was crap? And then he goes to say, well, that's pretty much like a psychopath. There's a lot of truth to that. Sometimes, like, people are getting by and have really no validity to whatever it is they're saying just because they believe what they're saying and the way they're presenting it. I think there might be something there, like a certain level of confidence can get you a bit further, which leads me into another thing, that the psychopaths are able to determine victims on the way that they walk. When I'm on campus, I'm always paying attention to how non-white people are always staring at the ground, or how avoidant we are in our nonverbal communication. And I think, which that leads me into the next thing I was about to say, that if this is some kind of like spectrum thing and you got like the severe cases of the psychopaths and then you have like maybe the other kinds or the like lesser psychopaths, I don't know how to describe it, but perhaps like in a context where you have like a hierarchy, like amongst themselves, they'll differentiate into whatever type of psychopath, but overall they'll be like a general psychopath for everybody else. So when they're around us, that when we, like, that same predator behavior happens with us. So then we take on this, like, lower, less victimized stance, and then they perform their psychopath behaviors on us. It said, I'm a Scorpion. It's my nature to sting you. Birds chirp. Dogs bark. White people practice white supremacy. And then, there's a part where someone says emotion is entropy. Entropy is disorder. I agree. Like, I don't know. I agree. The more I'm studying, the more observant I am. I just don't really feel like there's a place for emotion with the severity of our problem. That perhaps, I'm not, whatever, VGQ, but perhaps that nature might be beneficial. And then just the last part, when it's self-reporting psychopathy scale, 70% of those who scored high on the self-report psychopathy scale were able to correctly select the handkerchief-carrying thief or whatnot. Well, the thing is, if you self-report, right, as a psychopath, you know this, perhaps you've done research. If you've done research, maybe you decided these were characteristics you wanted to exude or that they fit you. So you're already going to take on that personality trait a little bit more than the people who are not the super high self-reporting psychopaths, in which case, naturally, you're going to select the person who has it because that person is not like the best actor ever. So you're paying attention to things that people aren't paying attention to. So the point is, even you don't necessarily really even have to be a psychopath. I remember looking at something that was saying that, some people actually want to be psychopaths. They want to do that because they want to be successful. So just by embodying certain characteristics would put you in a mental state to be able to be perhaps clear, less emotional, more observant, and I don't want to say more like a predator, but definitely less like a victim. So, all right, thank you.
Context of White Supremacy. Appreciate that. Emmy, if you have commentary, feel free, 641-715-3640. The code 564943 pound. Press *61 if you have commentary. I'll try and quickly get through some of my notes here. The very first sentence in the book, my father was a psychopath. In my view, that says quite a bit, just from the very beginning, in terms of, and then particularly when he goes into his father's dying days and the nurse or caretaker who was there to look in on him over his last few days. Even the incident about the calendar, that just stood out to me in great detail, the individual that we're talking about. And I thought Mr. Demery-Ford's assessment about, maybe some of that, they say the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. I think that's the metaphor. Maybe some of that was passed on to the Kevin Dutton, the author of the text. When he talked about Dahmer, I would say this for anyone who talks about Jeffrey Dahmer. This is someone who did go out and kill lots of people. I think he had about 17 victims approximately. I think almost everyone that he killed was a non-white person. I think except for maybe one. I think one of the first people that he killed. I think everybody else was a non-white person. Black males, non-white males in particular. Not pointing that out, that this seems like someone who talk about having a radar for victims and life that is not valued. Get dark people. I'll be able to kill them, eat them up for, years and years and years. We talked about Jeffrey Dahmer on the program before. Had Robert Dvorak. He wrote the biography on Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee Massacre. We had him on the program a couple times, in fact, and he went into great detail about Dahmer's radar, and we talked about the fact that he should be labeled exactly as Mr. Fuller says, classic example of a white supremacist, and he doesn't mention that at all in the text. Could be an act of racism on Mr. Dutton's part, where he says, deep inside me there's a serial killer lurking somewhere, but I keep him amused with cocaine, Formula One, booty calls, and corsicating cross-examination. This was a conversation that Mr. Dutton had, presumably with another white male in Europe. Again, this is whites. Now, this is an attorney. This is someone who's supposed to be not just a law-abiding. This is someone you are integral in upholding and practicing law, and you are using coke, lewd sexual activity, and fighting off your instincts to be a serial killer. Again, why did Dr. Rasayon say read this book? What does it mean to be white? Next note, he says, Of course, this is very important. Of course, it's in no way my intention to glamorize the actions of psychopaths, certainly not the actions of dysfunctional psychopaths anyway. I do not agree. And I think on the whole, white culture glorifies psychopaths all the time. White supremacy is about psychopathy. It is about killing. It is about terrorism, brutalizing non-white people, black people in particular. So you have got to glorify the psychopath. That's got to be critical to maintaining all of this worldwide. You look at the president. I think this term, I was thinking that the whole time, really during the first section, the term psychopath, the way that I've heard it used most recently has been in reference to Donald Trump. Is the president a psychopath? And what does that term mean? And giving a definition to it. Like, we do it, or I won't say we, excuse me, whites do it all the time, and I submit that Dutton is doing it in this book. In fact, I started alternating my highlights. That's one advantage of having a digital. I have regular highlights, and then I have specific color-coded highlights that are just for this sentence, because I think Mr. Dutton has glorified a number of psychopaths throughout the text, not even including his father. When he says the Scorpion Rising segment, when he says, I have cradled John Wayne Gacy's brain in my hands. Just the use of the word cradle. When I think of the term cradle, I think of a child, an infant, a baby, very sensitive. Oh, wow, want to be very careful. And he's talking about cradling, not a child, not a baby, but the brain of a white serial killer. That to me, I go back, does that sound like glamorizing the actions of psychopaths? Continuing with the book. Language for, I thought this was huge. What does it mean to be white? Where he says language for psychopaths is only word deep. There's no emotional contouring behind. A psychopath may say something like, I love you, but in reality, it's like a cup of coffee. I think Emmy mentioned that earlier. This is whites on a regular basis. I think they understand often what people want to hear, what victims of white supremacy want to hear. I think they frequently are very good about that, but it's certainly not with any sort of emotional connection for your well-being and I see you as an equal. Like, none of that at all. They are superbly cunning at that sort of thing. And I think we've had a lot of those type of examples of whites on the program. Where he says, with an endearing cloak of charm, but it was entirely in his nature to sting. Oh, and he's talking about the scorpion. Again, I think that's whites with an endearing cloak of charm. I think some of the more refined racists, Timothy Wise type racists, very, very charming, but it just has the goal of lowering your defenses so that you do not think of this white person, male or female, as a race soldier. Color-coded, going back, Glamourizing Psychopaths. He says, as we stand next to each other on a balmy spring morning, poking uneasily around John Wayne Gacy's bedroom, I ask him what the deal is. What is it about psychopaths that we find so irresistible? Why do they fascinate us so much? That entire sentence right there, to me, seems like, yes, there is a glamorization of Charles Manson, John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, who has, I think, 2 documentaries came out on Jeffrey Dahmer this year. The one that Roz mentioned, and I think there's another one that was an adaptation from a comic, a graphic novel that had been written about Dahmer some years ago, and I think they adapted that and made that into a documentary as well. That, to me, seems like glamorization. But also them standing in a bedroom. And as soon as he said it, I was staggered, like, dude, what? In his bedroom? What? And then when he continues to say, oh, okay, this is a replica in this museum that they have to serial killers, like, my word. I mean, you have black people who are struggling to maintain museums with artifacts of what's happened to black people worldwide and how whites have terrorized us. They're struggling to get funding. They had a black museum in St. Louis that was about to close down, and the Black Holocaust Museum in Philadelphia struggling to get funds and what have you. And they have a museum with replicas to serial killers. Are you kidding me? And this is in Europe. It wasn't even here where they got this museum of a serial killer who was on the other side of the planet. That is insanity. That again, white culture, a whole lot of the violence and terrorism of white culture, it gets normalized. We don't even think anything of this. Would this exist in a society of justice? Come on, let's go see the 5th documentary about Jeffrey Dahmer and how he killed 17 people and ate them. Can't wait. Wonder if they're going to put the part where he had them in the freezer in it this time. That is insanity. White culture. Continuing. That's the thing about psychopaths. On the outside, they seem so ordinary, yet scratch beneath the surface, peek inside the crawl space, as it were, and you never know what you might find. I was reminded when Mr. Fuller says that whites are the most familiar mystery. We should really keep that in mind at all times. Let's see. Already got the museum. I guess if anybody gets to that part of the world, maybe you can go check it out, take some pictures, let us know how it is. I thought, again, not just with Jeffrey Dahmer, Charles Manson, ignoring the racial component of his crime. He said he was trying to get a race war started and did his crimes and tried to blame it on black people that came in and killed all these whites. Any white person who talks about Charles Manson and ignores the white supremacist element of what he did, they're practicing racism. And if this guy is going all over the world visiting museums about serial killers, I'm very sure he knows the details about Charles Manson. Just the phrase, all-American smile, that he could tell a good victim simply from the way he walked, talking about John Wayne Gacy. That phrase, all-American smile, code word for white, could be, I think, often. I thought this was a really significant sentence as well when he said, again, talking about this is Ted Bundy, sorry, talking about Ted Bundy, different white killer. I'm the coldest son of a bitch you'll ever meet. Major Welsing moment, and I think the metaphors that he's using throughout the text, for the most part, talking about the heart of a psychopath being like a glacier and Ted Bundy being coldness. It reminds me very much of the Iceman Inheritance. This would have been Emmy's time to reference the book. But Iceman Inheritance, we had the author Michael Bradley on the program and him talking about the white race, specifically in his theory of them being in a cold environment led to their terroristic, psychopathic behavior. But it reminded me a lot because he's continuing to use that metaphor of cold, and even son of a bitch. Dr. Welsing, again, son of a dog, and the coldness reminded me of Dr. Welsing, fear of white genetic annihilation and melanin deficiency. Was lots of Welsing moments, all through. Even that entire metaphor about coldness might be relating to Dr. Welsing's theory. The whole part about the walk, we talked about that in detail with Jeffrey Dahmer, and I think quite a few of these other white killers. I think Jerry Sandusky, I think that's come up repeatedly. Something we've talked about in terms of the white radar, the psychopathic radar, them, and I think whites in general, they're very good. I think we talked about that, the importance of having black self-respect. When you ask questions, the way that you speak to white people, being able to look them in the eye, I think that sort of thing can let them know this might not be the easiest Negro to victimize. This one looks like, the programming hasn't worked as well. Maybe I can find someone who would be a little bit easier for me to terrorize. But the importance of black self-respect, it reminded me also, Minister Malcolm X, when he talked about we have been so terrorized and victimized that we walk with our head down so low that we can't even keep a hat on our head. Black self-respect. Last thing I'll get in, when he was talking about the physicians, this whole notion that you can learn something and that a psychopath in correct conditions and the correct context perhaps could be successful and do great things. When he gave the passage about the physician who says, I have no compassion for those whom I operate on, he told me, that is a luxury I simply cannot afford. In the theater, I am reborn as a cold, there it is again, heartless machine, totally at one with scalpel, drill, and saw. I didn't know if we were going to cut lumber or do an operation. When you're cutting loose and cheating death high above the snow line of the brain, feelings aren't fit for purpose. Emotion is entropy and seriously bad for business. I've hunted it down to extinction over the years. What a metaphor. I have hunted down emotion to extinction. Wow, even that is an act of violence, and not just violence, genocidal violence about emotion. That type of mentality, to me, explains medical apartheid, Harriet Washington, which is in my top 5, and it explains why we have the astronomical rate of iatrogenic deaths, what they call physician errors. This sort of mentality where you have butchers in the operating room and then you add racism on top of that. Oh yeah, I totally understand all of the problems that we have with the healthcare industry. Crystal, we have about 4 minutes till we get to the second audio segment. Other folks have comments they want. Oh, people got a hand up. The caller at 2161, did you have commentary you wanted to get in? 2161.
Yes, Gus. This is
Mr.
Scotty
Reed.
Green to you and all the callers. How are you?
Greetings. Good to hear from you, founder of the Black Talk Radio Network.
Yeah, interesting commentary thus far. A lot of in-depth analysis. I think everybody is spot on with their analysis. Some quick things I just wanted to add as they were talking about, the story about the scorpion in the frog. It just reminded me of a conversation I was having earlier with some folks about when we look at non-white countries that come out, quote unquote, come out from under colonialism, particularly African countries, and then in order to develop their infrastructure, they make contracts with the the International Monetary Fund, World Bankers, which are Europeans, the same people who you just allegedly came out. And so the whole thing about us being so trusting of people who have a history of abusing us, I think is a problem that is worldwide in terms of non-white people throwing off colonizers and then making deals with people like the World Bank. The commentary about psychopaths. Jeffrey Dahmer, I had watched a video on YouTube of a woman who had been watching, I don't know if it was a documentary or short documentary. I forget the name of the channel it was on recently. This was just recently. She said she was so disgusted by it that she had to turn it off. And she referenced an article that appeared in the Vice that is titled, "Why Do So Many People Sympathize with Serial Killer Jeffrey Dahmer?" And as you pointed out, that's not anything new because many of these serial killers have fan clubs and what have you. And I would, to answer their question, I would say is because they're psychopaths too. And apparently, you're able to, I would say this in general terms, most people empathize with people who are like them or who look like them or share culture or share something in common. So I would say that's why so many people sympathize with Jeffrey Dahmer is because this whole society was built by psychopaths. And my question is, can we accurately call this? I mean, I know what the DSM says about it being a mental illness or a disorder, but it seems to be the norm among white people, primarily, white supremacists. So it seems like that's their normal mode of operating. So is it mental illness or is it just the way they think or act and behave? And it's totally normal to them. That's all I wanted to share. Thank you.
Mr. Scotty Reed, founder of the Black Talk Radio Network. Great to hear from you. And I totally agree with individuals classified as white. Psychopathic behavior is the norm. In fact, I would probably say you could do it as both. I think it is a mental disorder. I certainly don't think that should be looked at as something that is typical with regards to human behavior. But with whites, it is the norm. And in my view, white culture, you just see that glorified, celebrated worldwide. I think this book is a great illustration. That's something I'm going to be taking specific notes for because he said specifically that his book is not about glamorizing psychopaths and especially the violent ones. I submit that that is not the case. So I'll be looking to take notes about that as we can proceed through the text. This book is a little off balance, unfortunately. We have not completed the first chapter in the text. It's like they have sub-chapters, right? So this is all technically in chapter 1. We're still in chapter 1 when we get back to the second audio segment. And it's lengthy. I think we are going to get all the way through chapter 1, but it's a little longer. So we need to go ahead and start now. That way we will have ample time to discuss once it concludes. So if you have additional comments that you didn't get in, additional things you want to make sure to share, just make a note and we'll have time to share once the second segment concludes. So this is Mr. Kevin Dutton, The Wisdom of Psychopaths. The portion where we're picking up, it's Psychopath Radar. Psychopath Radar. It's in chapter 1. Context of White Supremacy. This is audio segment number 2.
Psychopath Radar. In 2003, Reed Malloy, professor of psychiatry at the University of California, San Diego School of Medicine, conducted an experiment that looked at the flip side of the scarlet handkerchief equation. Sure, traditional hole-in-one psychopaths may well have a reputation for sniffing out vulnerability, but they're also known for giving us the creeps. Tales from clinical practice and reports from everyday life are replete with utterances from those who've encountered these ruthless social predators. Mysterious, visceral aphorisms such as, "The hair stood up on the back of my neck," or "He made my skin crawl." But is there really anything to it? Do our instincts stand up to scrutiny? Are we as good at picking up on psychopaths as psychopaths are at picking up on us? To find out, Malloy asked 450 criminal justice and mental health professionals whether they'd ever experienced such odd physical reactions when interviewing a psychopathic subject. Violent criminals with all of the dials on the mixing desk cranked right up to max. The results left nothing to the imagination. Over 3/4 of them said that they had, with female respondents reporting a higher incidence of the phenomenon than males, 84% compared to 71%, and master's/bachelor level clinicians reporting a higher incidence than either those at doctoral level or, on the other side of the professional divide, law enforcement agents, 84%, 78%, and 61%, respectively. Examples included felt like I might be lunch, disgust, repulsion, fascination, and an evil essence passed through me. But what are we picking up on exactly? To answer this question, Malloy goes back in time to prehistory and the shadowy, spectral dictates of human evolution. There are a number of theories about how psychopathy might first have developed, and we're looking at those a little later on. But an overarching question in the grand etiological scheme of things is from which ontological perspective the condition should actually be viewed, from a clinical standpoint as a disorder of personality, or from a game theory standpoint as a legitimate biological gambit, a life history strategy conferring significant reproductive advantages in the primeval, ancestral environment. Kent Bailey, emeritus professor in clinical psychology at Virginia Commonwealth University, argues in favor of the latter and advances the theory that violent competition within and between ancestral groups was a primary evolutionary precursor of psychopathy, or, as he puts it, the mindset of the warrior hawk. Some degree of predatory violence, proposes Bailey, was required in the seek-and-kill aspects of hunting large game animals, and an elite contingent of ruthless warrior hawks would presumably have come in handy not only for tracking and killing prey, but as a ready-made defense force to repel invasion by similar contingents from other neighboring groups. The problem, of course, was how to trust them in peacetime. Robin Dunbar, professor of evolutionary anthropology at Oxford University, lends support to Bailey's claims. Going back to the time of the Norsemen between the 9th and 12th centuries, Dunbar has cited the berserkers as a case in point. The fetid Viking warriors who, as the sagas and poems and historical records attest, appear to have fought in a brutal, trance-like fury. But dig a little deeper into the literature, and a more sinister picture emerges of a dangerous elite who could turn against members of the community they were charged to protect, committing savage acts of violence against their countrymen. Here, proposes Malloy, lies the solution to the mystery, to the prickle at the back of the neck and the long-range evolutionary thinking behind our indwelling psychopath radar. For if, as Kent Bailey argues, such predatory ancestral individuals were indeed psychopathic, it would follow, from what we know of natural selection, that it wouldn't be a one-way street. More peaceable members of both the immediate and wider communities would, in all probability, themselves evolve a mechanism, the covert neural surveillance technology, to flag up and signify danger when entering their cognitive airspace, a clandestine early warning system that would enable them to beat a retreat. In the light of Angela Book's work with attack victims and my own investigations into scarlet handkerchief smuggling, such a mechanism could quite plausibly explain the gender differences revealed by Malloy's experiment. Given psychopaths' enhanced reputation as diabolical emotional sommeliers, their specialized nose for the inscrutable bass notes of weakness, it isn't beyond the bounds of possibility that women, by way of a sneaky Darwinian recompense for greater physical vulnerability, exhibit more intense and more frequent reactions in their presence, as for exactly the same reason did the lower status mental health workers. It's certainly a working hypothesis. The more you feel threatened, the more at risk you are for a break-in, the more important it is to tighten up on security. Of course, that there existed in the penumbral days of our ancestors ruthless, remorseless hunters brutally accomplished in the dark arts of predation is beyond doubt. But that such hunters, with their capacity to second-guess nature, were psychopaths as we know them in the 21st century is a little more open to question. Diagnostically, the stumbling block is empathy. In ancestral times, the most prolific and accomplished hunters were not, as one might expect, the most bloodthirsty and indefatigable. They were, in contrast, the most cool and empathetic. They were the ones who were able to assimilate their quarry's mindset, to see through the eyes of their prey, and thus reliably predict its deft, innate trajectories of evasion, its routes and machinations of escape. To understand why, one need only observe a toddler learning to walk. The gradual development of upright locomotion, of an increasingly bipedal stance, both heralded and facilitated a brand-new era of early hominid grocery shopping. A vertical stance prefigured streamlined, more efficient mobility, enabling our forebears on the African savanna to forage and hunt for considerably longer periods than quadrupedal locomotion would have allowed. But persistence hunting, as it's known in anthropology, has problems of its own. Wildebeest and antelopes can easily outsprint a human. They can vanish over the horizon. If you can accurately predict where they might eventually stop, either by looking for clues that they've left behind in their flight or by reading their minds, or both, you can marginally increase your chances of survival. So if predators demonstrate empathy, and in some cases even enhanced empathy, how can they really be psychopaths? If there's one thing most people agree on, it's that psychopaths exhibit a marked absence of feeling, a singular lack of understanding of others. How do we square the circle? Help is at hand in the form of cognitive neuroscience, with a bit of an assist from some fiendish moral philosophy. Trolleyology. Joshua Green, a psychologist, neuroscientist, and philosopher at Harvard University, has observed how psychopaths unscramble moral dilemmas, how their brains respond inside different ethical compression chambers. He stumbled upon something interesting. Far from being uniform, empathy is schizophrenic. There are two distinct varieties, hot and cold. Consider, for example, the following conundrum, Case 1, first proposed by the philosopher Philippa Foot. A railway trolley is hurtling down a track. In its path are 5 people who are trapped on the line and cannot escape. Fortunately, you can flip a switch that will divert the trolley down a fork in the track away from the 5 people, but at a price. There is another person trapped down that fork, and the trolley will kill them instead, should you hit the switch. Most people have little trouble deciding what to do in this scenario. Though the thought of flicking the switch isn't exactly a nice one, the utilitarian option, killing just one person instead of 5, represents the least worst choice. Agreed? Now, consider the following variation, Case 2, proposed by the philosopher Judith Jarvis Thomson. As before, a railway trolley is speeding out of control down a track toward 5 people. But this time, you are standing behind a very large stranger on a footbridge above the tracks. The only way to save the 5 people is to heave the stranger over. He will fall to a certain death, but his considerable girth will block the trolley, saving 5 lives. Should you push him? Here, you might say we're faced with a real dilemma. Although the score in lives is precisely the same as in the first example, 5-1, one's choice of action is far trickier. Yet why should this be? Green believes he has the answer, and that it all boils down to temperature. Case 1, he proposes, is what we might call an impersonal moral dilemma. It involves those areas of the brain, the prefrontal cortex and posterior parietal cortex, in particular the anterior paracingulate cortex, the temporal pole, and the superior temporal sulcus, primarily responsible for cold empathy, for reasoning and rational thought. Case 2, on the other hand, is what we might call a personal moral dilemma. It involves the emotional center of the brain, known as the amygdala, the circuit of hot empathy. Just like most normal members of the population, psychopaths have relatively few problems with Case 1. They flip the switch and the train diverts accordingly, killing just the one person instead of 5. However, this is where the plot thickens. Quite unlike normal people, they also experience little difficulty with Case 2. Psychopaths, without a moment's hesitation, are perfectly happy to chuck the fat guy over the side, if that's how the cookie crumbles. Moreover, this difference in behavior has a distinct neural signature. The pattern of brain activation in both psychopaths and normal people is identical on the presentation of impersonal moral dilemmas, but radically different when things start to get a bit more personal. Imagine that I were to hook you up to an fMRI machine and then present you with 2 dilemmas. What would I observe as you went about trying to solve them? Well, at the precise moment that the nature of the dilemma changed from impersonal to personal, I would see your amygdala and related brain circuits, your medial orbitofrontal cortex, for example, light up like a pinball machine. I would witness the moment, in other words, when emotion puts its money in the slot. But in a psychopath, I would see nothing. The cavernous neural casino would remain in darkness, and the passage from impersonal to personal would slip by unnoticed. This distinction between hot and cold empathy, the kind of empathy that we feel when observing others, and the steely emotional calculus that allows us to gauge coolly and dispassionately what another person might be thinking, should be music to the ears of theorists such as Reed Malloy and Kent Bailey. Sure, psychopaths may well be deficient in the former variety, the touchy-feely type, but when it comes to the latter commodity, the kind that codes for understanding rather than feeling, the kind that enables abstract, nerveless prediction as opposed to personal identification, the kind that relies on symbolic processing instead of effective symbiosis, the cognitive skill set possessed by expert hunters and cold readers, not just in the natural environment, but in the human arena too, then psychopaths are in a league of their own. They fly even better on one empathy engine than on two, which is, of course, just one of the reasons why they make such good persuaders. If you know where the buttons are and don't feel the heat when you push them, then chances are you're going to hit the jackpot. The empathy divide is certainly music to the ears of Robin Dunbar, who, when he's not reading up on berserkers, can sometimes be found in the Magdalen College senior common room. One afternoon, over tea and cakes, in an oak-paneled alcove overlooking the cloisters, I tell him about the railway trolleys and the difference they reveal between psychopathic and normal brain function. He's not in the least bit surprised. The Vikings had a pretty good run of things back in their day, he points out, and the berserkers certainly didn't do anything to dispel their reputation as a people not to be messed with. But that was their job. Their role was to be more ruthless, more cold-blooded, more savage than the average Viking soldier, because that was exactly who they were. They were more ruthless, more cold-blooded, more savage than the average Viking soldier. If you'd wired up a berserker to a brain scanner and presented him with the trolley dilemma, I'm fairly certain I know what you'd have got. Exactly what you get with psychopaths. Nothing. And the fat bloke would have been history. I butter myself a scone. I think every society needs particular individuals to do its dirty work for it, he continues. Someone who isn't afraid to make tough decisions, ask uncomfortable questions, put themselves on the line. And a lot of the time, those individuals, by the very nature of the work that they're tasked to do, aren't necessarily going to be the kind of people who you'd want to sit down and have afternoon tea with. Cucumber sandwich? Daniel Bartles at Columbia University and David Pizarro at Cornell couldn't agree more, and they've got documentary evidence to prove it. Studies have shown that approximately 90% of people would refuse to push the stranger off the bridge, even though they know that if they could just overcome their natural moral squeamishness, the body count would become 1/5 as high. That, of course, leaves 10% unaccounted for. A less morally hygienic minority who, when push quite literally comes to shove, have little or no compunction about holding another person's life in the balance. But who is this unscrupulous minority? Who is this 10%? To find out, Bartles and Pizarro presented the trolley problem to more than 200 students and got them to indicate on a 4-point scale how much they were in favor of shoving the fat guy over the side, how utilitarian they were. Then, alongside the trolleyological question, the students also responded to a series of personality items specifically designed to measure resting psychopathy levels. These included statements such as, "I like to see fistfights," and "the best way to handle people is to tell them what they want to hear." Agree/disagree on a scale of 1 to 10. Could the two constructs, psychopathy and utilitarianism, possibly be linked, Bartles and Pizarro wondered? The answer was a resounding yes. Their analysis revealed a significant correlation between a utilitarian approach to the trolley problem, push the fat guy off the bridge, and a predominantly psychopathic personality style. As far as Robin Dunbar's prediction goes, that's pretty much on the money. But as far as the traditional take on utilitarianism goes, it's somewhat problematic. In the grand scheme of things, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, the two 19th century British philosophers credited with formalizing the theory of utilitarianism, are generally thought of as good guys. The greatest happiness of the greatest number is the foundation of morals and legislation, Bentham once famously articulated. Yet dig a little deeper, and a trickier, quirkier, murkier picture appears. one of ruthless selectivity and treacherous moral riptides. Crafting that legislation, for example, excavating those morals, will inevitably necessitate riding roughshod over someone else's interests. Some group or cause, through the simple lottery of numbers, has to bite the bullet for the sake of the greater good. But who has got the balls to pull the trigger? Bartles and Pizarro may well have found a pattern in the lab, but what about in everyday life? Is this where the psychopath really comes into his own? Dark side of the moon landing. The question of what it takes to succeed in a given profession, to deliver the goods and get the job done, is not all that difficult when it comes down to it. Alongside the dedicated skill set necessary to perform one's specific duties, there exists, in law, in business, in whatever field of endeavor you care to mention, a selection of traits that code for high achievement. In 2005, Belinda Board and Katerina Fritzen of the University of Surrey conducted a survey to find out precisely what it was that made business leaders tick. What they wanted to know were the key facets of personality that separated those who turn left when boarding an airplane from those who turn right. Board and Fritzen took 3 groups: business managers, psychiatric patients, and hospitalized criminals, both those who were psychopathic and those suffering from other psychiatric illnesses, and compared how they fared on a psychological profiling test. Their analysis revealed that a number of psychopathic attributes were actually more common in business leaders than in so-called disturbed criminals. Attributes such as superficial charm, egocentricity, persuasiveness, lack of empathy, independence, and focus, and that the main difference between the groups was in the more antisocial aspects of the syndrome. The criminals' law-breaking, physical aggression, and impulsivity dials, to return to our analogy of earlier, were cranked up higher. Other studies seem to confirm the mixing desk picture. The borderline between functional and dysfunctional psychopathy depends not on the presence of psychopathic attributes per se, but rather on their levels and the way they're combined. Mehmet Mahmut and his colleagues at Macquarie University have recently shown that patterns of brain dysfunction, specifically in relation to the orbital frontal cortex, the area of the brain that regulates the input of the emotions and decision-making, observed in both criminal and non-criminal psychopaths, exhibit dimensional rather than discrete differences. This, he suggests, means that the 2 groups should not be viewed as qualitatively distinct populations, but rather as occupying different positions on the same neuropsychological continuum. In a similar, if less high-tech vein, I ask a class of first-year undergraduates to imagine they were managers in a job placement company. Ruthless, fearless, charming, amoral, and focused, I told them. Suppose you had a client with that kind of profile. To which line of work do you think they might be suited? Their answers, as we shall see a little later on in the book, couldn't have been more insightful. CEO, spy, surgeon, politician, the military. They all popped up in the mix, along with serial killer, assassin, and bank robber. Intellectual ability on its own is just an elegant way of finishing second, one successful CEO told me. Remember, they don't call it a greasy pole for nothing. The road to the top is hard, but it's easier to climb if you lever yourself up on others. Easier still if they think something's in it for them. John Moulton, one of London's most successful venture capitalists, agrees. In a recent interview with the Financial Times, he lists determination, curiosity, and insensitivity as his 3 most valuable character traits. No prizes for guessing the first 2, but insensitivity? The great thing about insensitivity, explains Moulton, is that it lets you sleep when others can't. If the idea of psychopathic traits lending a hand in business doesn't come as too great a surprise, then how about in space? Blasting psychopaths off deep into the cosmos does not, I am sure, given their terrestrial reputation, particularly inspire confidence. And psychopathic qualities, you'd think, might not exactly be foremost among NASA's prohibitively exclusive selection criteria for astronauts. But there's a story I once heard that provides a graphic illustration of how the refrigerated neurology that showed up on Robert Hare's brain scans can, in certain situations, confer real benefits. The reptilian focus and crystalline detachment of neurosurgeon James Garrity can sometimes code for greatness, not just in the boardroom, the courtroom, and the operating theater, but in another world entirely. The story goes like this. On July 20th, 1969, as Neil Armstrong and his partner Buzz Aldrin zipped across the lunar landscape looking for a place to set their module down, they came within seconds of crash landing. The problem was geology. There was just too much of it, and fuel too little. Rocks and boulders lay scattered all over the place, making a safe approach impossible. Aldrin mopped his brow. With one eye on the gas gauge and the other on the terrain, he issued Armstrong a stark ultimatum. Get this thing down, and fast. Armstrong, however, was decidedly more phlegmatic. Maybe, who knows, he'd never had time for twitchy backseat drivers. But with the clock running down, the fuel running out, and the prospect of death by gravity an ever-increasing possibility, he coolly came up with a game plan. Aldrin was to convert into seconds the amount of fuel they had left and to start counting down, out loud. Aldrin did as he was asked. 70, 60, 50. As he counted, Armstrong scrutinized the moon's unyielding topography. 40, 30, 20. Still, the landscape refused to give an inch. Then, with just 10 seconds remaining, Armstrong spotted his chance, a silver oasis of nothingness just below the horizon. Suddenly, imperceptibly, like a predator closing in on its prey, his brain narrowed its focus. As if he were on a practice run, he maneuvered the craft deftly toward the drop zone and performed, in the only clearing for miles, the perfect textbook touchdown. One giant leap for mankind, but almost, very nearly, one giant cosmological screw-up. Bomb disposal experts. What makes them tick? This extraordinary account of incredible interplanetary insouciance epitomizes life on the horizons of possibility, where triumph and disaster share a fraught and fragile frontier, and cross-border traffic flows freely. This time, however, the road to disaster was closed, and Neil Armstrong's coolness under fire rescued from cosmological calamity one of the greatest ever feats in the history of human achievement. But there's more. His heart rate, reports revealed later, barely broke a sweat. He might as well have been landing a job in a gas station as a spaceship on the moon. Some freakish strain of cardiovascular genius? The science suggests not. Back in the 1980s, Harvard researcher Stanley Rockman found something similar with bomb disposal operatives. What Rockman wanted to know separated the men from the boys in this high-risk, high-wire profession. All bomb disposal operatives are good, otherwise they'd be dead. But what did the stars have that the lesser luminaries didn't? To find out, he took a bunch of experienced bomb disposal operatives, those with 10 years or more in the business, and split them into two groups, those who'd been decorated for their work and those who hadn't. Then he compared their heart rates in the field on jobs that demanded particularly high levels of concentration. What he turned up was astonishing. Whereas the heart rates of all the operatives remained stable, something quite incredible happened with the ones who'd been decorated. Their heart rates actually went down. As soon as they entered the danger zone, or the launch pad, as one guy I spoke with put it, they assumed a state of cold, meditative focus, a mezzanine level of consciousness in which they became one with the device they were working on. Follow-up analysis probed deeper and revealed the cause of the disparity: confidence. The operatives who'd been decorated scored higher on tests of core self-belief than their non-decorated colleagues. It was conviction that made them tick. Stanley Rockman knows all about the fearless, Arctic neurology of the psychopath, and his findings were certainly explosive. So much so that he raised the question himself, should we be keeping a closer eye on our bomb disposal operatives? His conclusion seems pretty clear. The operators who received awards for courageous/fearless behavior, he reports, were free of psychological abnormalities or antisocial behavior. In contrast, he points out, most descriptions of psychopathy include adjectives such as irresponsible and impulsive. Adjectives that, in his experience, did not befit any of his case studies. In the light of Belinda Board and Katerina Fritzen's 2005 survey, however, which, if you will recall, demonstrated that a number of psychopathic traits were more prevalent among business leaders than among diagnosed criminal psychopaths, Rockman's comments beg the question of what precisely we mean when we use the word psychopath. Not all psychopaths are as wholly undomesticated, as socially feral as he might have us believe. In fact, the standout implication of Board and Fritzen's study is the suggestion that it is precisely this antisocial wing of the disorder, comprising the elements of impulsivity and irresponsibility, that either makes or breaks psychopaths, that codes them, depending on how high these particular personality dials are turned up, for dysfunction or success. To throw another methodological monkey wrench in the works, it turns out that bomb disposal operatives aren't the only ones who experience a drop in heart rate when they get down to business. Relationship experts Neil Jacobson and John Gottman, authors of the popular book When Men Batter Women, have observed identical cardiovascular profiles in certain types of abusers who, research has shown, actually become more relaxed when beating up their partners than when they're lounging in an armchair with their eyes closed. In their widely cited typology of abusers, Jacobson and Gottman refer to individuals with this type of profile as cobras. Cobras, unlike their opposite numbers, the pit bulls, attack swiftly and ferociously and remain in control. They possess a grandiose sense of entitlement to whatever they feel like, whenever they feel like it. In addition, as their name suggests, they become calm and focused prior to launching an offensive. Pit bulls, on the other hand, are emotionally more volatile, more prone to let things fester and then fly off the handle. Further comparisons between these two groups make interesting reading. Cobras, violence more severe. Pit bulls, violence less severe. Cobras, use of closed fist/strangling, 91%. Pit bulls, use of closed fist/strangling, 62%. Cobras, threaten partner with knife or gun, 38%. Pit bulls, threatened partner with knife or gun, 4%. Cobras, actual use of knife or gun on partner, 9%. Pit bulls, actual use of knife or gun on partner, 0%. Cobras, violence outside relationship, 44%. Pit bulls, violence outside relationship, 3%. Cobras, able to let go and move on. Pit bulls, become obsessed. Cobras, do not fear abandonment. Pit bulls, prone to insecurity. Cobras, charismatic. Pit bulls, tend to be more introverted. Cobras, manipulative, partners less likely to leave. Pit bulls, partners more likely to leave. Cobras, antisocial, 90%. Pit bulls, antisocial, 33%. Devastating fearlessness may well be descended from courage, as Rockman proposes in Bomb Disposal. It may well habituate through repeated exposure to danger. But there are some individuals who claim it as their birthright, and whose basic biology is so fundamentally different from the rest of ours as to remain, both consciously and unconsciously, completely impenetrable to even the minutest trace of anxiety antigens. I know, because I've tested them. The scent of fear. If you've ever been spooked by in-flight turbulence, or become slightly uneasy when a train has stopped in a tunnel, or simply experienced that indefinable feeling of dread that something just isn't quite right, you may have been responding to the fears of those around you just as much as to anything else. In 2009, Lilian Mujica-Parodi, a cognitive neuroscientist at Stony Brook University in New York, collected sweat from the armpits of first-time skydivers as they hurtled toward the ground at terminal velocity. Back in the lab, she then transferred the sweat from absorbent pads secured under volunteers' arms, as well as samples of normal fear-light treadmill sweat, to a specially calibrated nebulizer box, and waved it under the noses of a second bunch of volunteers as they sat in an fMRI scanner. Guess what? Even though none of the volunteers had any idea what they were inhaling, those who were exposed to the fear sweat showed considerably more activity in their brain's fear-processing zip codes, their amygdalae and hypothalami, than those who'd breathed the exercise sweat. In addition, on an emotion recognition task, volunteers who had inhaled the fear sweat were 43% more accurate at judging whether a face bore a threatening or neutral expression than those who'd gotten the workout sweat. All of which raises a rather interesting question. Can we catch fear in the same way we catch a cold? Mujica-Parodi and her team certainly seem to think so. In the light of their findings, they allude to the possibility that there may be a hidden biological component to human social dynamics in which emotional stress is, quite literally, contagious. Which raises, of course, an even more interesting question. What about immunity? Are some of us more likely to come down with the fear bug than others? Do some of us have more of a nose for it? To find out, I ran a variation on Mujica-Parodi's study. First, I showed one group of volunteers a scary movie, Candyman, and got a second group on a treadmill. Next, I collected their sweat. Third, I bottled it, so to speak. Finally, I squirted it up the noses of a second group of volunteers as they played a simulated gambling game. The game in question was the Cambridge Gamble Task, a computerized test of decision-making under risk. The test comprises a sequence of trials in which participants are presented with an array of 10 boxes, either red or blue in color, and must guess on each trial which of these boxes conceals a yellow token. The proportion of colored boxes varies from trial to trial, e.g. 6 red and 4 blue, 1 blue and 9 red, and participants start off with a total of 100 points, a fixed proportion of which 5%, 25%, 50%, 75%, 95%, they must bet on the outcome of the first trial. What happens then is contingent on the result. Depending on whether they win or lose, the amount wagered is either added to or subtracted from their initial tally, and the protocol is repeated with a rolling total on all subsequent trials. Higher bets are associated with higher risk. If Mujica-Parodi's theory held any water, then the prediction was pretty straightforward. volunteers who inhaled the Candyman sweat would exercise greater caution and gamble more conservatively than those who inhaled the treadmill sweat. But there was a catch. Half the volunteers were psychopaths. Would the psychopaths, noted for their coolness under pressure, be immune to others' stress? Like expert hunters and trackers, might they be hypervigilant for visual cues of vulnerability, as Angela Book discovered, yet chemically impervious to olfactory ones? The result of the experiment couldn't have been any clearer. Exactly as predicted by Mujica Perotti's findings, the non-psychopathic volunteers played their cards pretty close to their chests when exposed to the fear sweat, staking lower percentages on outcomes. But the psychopaths remained unfazed. Not only were they more daring to start with, they were also more daring to finish with, continuing to take risks even when pumped full of fear. Their neurological immune systems seemed to immediately crack down on the virus, adopting a zero-tolerance policy on anxiety, while the rest of us just allow it to spread. Double-edged sword. Glimpsed in passing through a shop window, or more likely these days on Amazon, the wisdom of psychopaths may seem rather an odd conglomeration of words to appear on the front cover of a book. Eye-catching, maybe, but odd, most certainly. The jarring juxtaposition of those two existential monoliths, wisdom and psychopaths, precipitates, one would have thought, little semantic compromise, little in the way of constructive, meaningful dialogue around the logic-scored scientific negotiating table. And yet, the core underlying thesis that psychopaths are in possession of wisdom is a serious one. Not, perhaps, wisdom in the traditional sense of that word, as an emergent property of advancing years and cumulative life experience, but as an innate, ineffable function of their being. Consider, for example, the following analogy from someone we'll be meeting later, a psychopath. Within, I should add, the rarefied cloistral confines of a maximum security personality disorder unit. A powerful top-of-the-range sports car is neither a good thing nor a bad thing in and of itself, but depends on the person who's sitting behind the wheel. It may, for instance, permit a skilled and experienced motorist to get his wife to the hospital in time to give birth to their child, or, in a parallel universe, run an 18-year-old and his girlfriend off a cliff. In essence, it's all in the handling, quite simply, the skill of the driver. He's right. Perhaps the one standalone feature of the psychopath, the ultimate killer difference that distinguishes the psychopathic personality from the personalities of most normal members of the population, is that psychopaths don't give a damn what their fellow citizens think of them. They simply couldn't care less how society as a whole might contemplate their actions. In a world in which image and branding and reputation are more sacrosanct than ever, what are we up to now? 500 million on Facebook, 200 million videos on YouTube, one closed-circuit TV camera for every 20 people in the UK? This constitutes, no doubt, one of the fundamental reasons why they run into so much trouble. And, of course, why we find them so beguiling. Yet it may also predispose to heroism and mental toughness, to estimable qualities such as courage, integrity, and virtue, the ability, for instance, to dart into blazing buildings to save the lives of those inside, or to push fat guys off of bridges and stop runaway trains in their tracks. Psychopathy really is like a high-performance sports car. It's a double-edged sword that inevitably cuts both ways. In the following chapters, I'll chronicle in scientific, sociological, and philosophical detail the story of this double-edged sword and the unique psychological profile of the individuals that wield it. We begin by looking at who, precisely, the psychopath really is, if not the monster we usually think of. We travel through both the inner and outer zones of the psychopathic metropolis, cruising the ultra-violent downtown ghettos and the lighter, leafier, more visitor-friendly suburbs. As on any scale or spectrum, both ends have their poster boy Hall of Famers. At one end, we have the Dahmers and Lecters and Bundys, the Rippers and Slashers and Stranglers. At the other extreme, we have the anti-psychopaths, elite spiritual athletes like Tibetan Buddhist monks who, through years of black belt meditation in remote Himalayan monasteries, feel nothing but compassion. In fact, the latest research from the field of cognitive neuroscience suggests that the spectrum might be circular, that across the neural dateline of sanity and madness, the psychopaths and the anti-psychopaths sit within touching distance of each other. So near and yet so far. From far-flung neural datelines, we'll shift our focus to cognitive archaeology, and having sketched out the coordinates of modern-day psychopathy, we'll go in search of its origins. Using the instruments of game theory and cutting-edge evolutionary psychology, we will reconstruct the conditions deep in our ancestral past under which psychopaths might have evolved, and we'll explore the possibility, as profound as it is disturbing, that in 21st century society, they're continuing to evolve, and that the disorder is becoming adaptive. We'll consider in depth the advantages of being a psychopath, or rather, in some situations at least, having those dials turned up a little higher than normal. We'll look at the fearlessness, the ruthlessness, the presence. Psychopaths tend to blink just a little less than the rest of us, a physiological aberration that often helps give them their unnerving hypnotic air. Devastating, dazzling, and super confident are the epithets that one often hears about them. Not, as one might expect, from themselves, but from their victims. The irony is plain as day. Psychopaths appear, through some Darwinian practical joke, to possess the very personality traits that many of us would die for. Indeed, that many have died for. The reason, of course, why our old friend Fabricio Rossi had trouble believing that anything good could possibly come out of the crawl space. We'll go behind the scenes of one of the most fetid psychopath units in the world and get a psychopath's take on the problems, dilemmas, and challenges that each of us faces during the course of everyday life. We'll catch up with the neuroscientist and psychopath hunter Kent Keel as he trawls an 18-wheeled truck housing a custom-built fMRI scanner around America's state penitentiaries. And in a groundbreaking, one-off experiment, I finally undergo a psychopath makeover myself, as a world-renowned expert in transcranial magnetic stimulation simulates, with the aid of some remote, non-invasive neurosurgery, a psychopathic brain state inside my own head. It's worn off. As the wisdom of psychopaths unfolds, the truth, like a remorseless predator itself, slowly begins to close in. Sure, these guys might sting us, but they might also save our lives. Either way, they do have something to teach us.
Context of White Supremacy, and that is where we will conclude. We'll pick up next week right at the beginning of Chapter 2. Will the real psychopath please stand up? If you would like to participate, share a word. The number 641-715-3640. The code 564-943. #. Press *61 if you would like to participate. We have about a half hour, so do not lollygag. Please don't wait until the last minute if you have commentary you would like to share. Folks who dialed in with a hand up, line should be open. Making sure, I'm trying to see if we have any folks that we've not heard from at all. If we haven't heard from you at all and you have a comment that you want to share, you should dial in immediately. We'll get to you first. That way we'll make sure not to miss anyone. Right now, I think I'm not seeing any new hands. So all the folks that we had with us, I think Roz, Mr. Demrick 4, Emmy, Mr. Reed, and Rob in Wisconsin. Your line should be open. If you had commentary, proceed.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
All right. From the last segment, I thought that Mr. Reed actually brought up some great information, and when you were talking about the section you read at that time, and I forget which psychopath it was, but he had used the term "son of a bitch," and you talked about that being a Dr. Welsing moment for you. It was for me as well, because I immediately thought of Romulus and Remus, which is the story of a she-wolf that suckled two white male twins from Rome, and from these two white male twins suckled by a she-wolf, there sprung the Roman Empire and just Roman people. So I just found that to be a very telling thing. And also in reference to Jeffrey Dahmer, another thing I learned about him was that he raped children. The first non-white person he raped, there was actually two white males that he had killed as well. But the first one he had actually sexually terrorized was a 13-year-old guy from the Far East. I forget which country it was, Malaysia I think it was, or Thailand. And then he also raped and killed his brother. That was the guy who got away, and the police ended up bringing him back to Jeffrey Dahmer. He actually raped one brother and raped and killed the other brother. So I just wanted to just put that out there too. And also I've learned that two men came out, a black male and a white male, that were raped by him in the military at the age of 17. They happened to be his roommates in the military, and they came out and spoke out for the first time in history to tell the stories of Jeffrey Dahmer raping both of them, subsequently at the age of 17, drugging them, raping them, terrorizing them, and all kinds of stuff. So that documentary is just fascinating in that regard. Also, this book so far has made me think. This past summer, I read an article, and I talked about it on a few occasions on my own radio show, that discussed the fact that white people have no empathy for non-white people. And they had done all of these tests, brain tests, on a large group of white people and a group of non-white people, and they found that they would just show them videos of people performing regular tasks, and that the non-white people's brains would be triggered in the amygdala and the areas of emotional empathy when they saw either white people or non-white people performing the task. And when they did the same test on white people, they only had an emotional response when they saw white people performing tasks, and they had no emotional response whatsoever to any non-white people that were doing the same exact task. So they're all psychopathic. It's just the level of which they tend to expose that psychopathy around you on an individual basis, but each and every one of them are psychopathic. Also, we talked about him glorifying this, and I think he is a psychopath, and I think he alluded to that towards the end of the text. But all throughout the text, he's been glorifying psychopathy. He's been discussing how many different advantages that it provides people, and he's said that multiple times, and that's the exact phrase he's using, that there's advantages to being a psychopath. One is where he was actually practicing racism at the same time. He says this is towards the end of the reading. He said, we travel through the inner and outer zones of the psychopathic metropolis, cruising the ultraviolet downtown ghettos and the lighter, leafier, more visitor-friendly suburbs. So he's anthropomorphizing psychopathy. He's making it a human being and they're traveling through the inner outer states of the psychopathic metropolis, cruising ultraviolet downtown ghettos and the lighter, leafier, more visitor-friendly suburbs. Humans do that. So he's basically glorifying being a psychopath in a very, very profound way by anthropomorphizing the act of being psychopathic. Also, he also uses words where he'll say that he'll like on page 13 he wrote. He said examples included, I felt like, and he's talking about people who were describing their experiences with psychopaths. So he said, I felt like I might be lunch, disgust, repulsion, fascination, and evil essence passed through me. So again, he'll use those words, disgust, repulsion, and then throw something like fascination. All of the use of these words are almost like an advertisement for different aspects of a psychopathic mindset, and he discusses them in ways in which he makes it appear as if these things can be advantageous to you in certain ways. The only people that I've seen that has functioned and gotten any advantage from psychopathic, sociopathic, and acute narcissistic behavior are white people. And everything he's describing in his book is everything that I've seen from just about every white person that I've ever met. And even the ones who I didn't think directly practiced racism on me, when I went through my history, I found that they practiced it in some other form or fashion, which is just a different application of the psychopathic mind model. Thank you. I'll mute my line.
Appreciate that, Roz. Other folks who dialed in with a hand up, if you have commentary, line should be open. Proceed.
Yes, sir. Unless there's somebody who hasn't spoke, I would like to speak again. Okay. Couple of things. Again, this is Scotty from North Carolina. The trolley experiment made me think of a term called collateral damage, where you have people in the military or even the so-called commander-in-chief, who would be the CEO of USA Inc., aka the president, where they decide to bomb civilian areas just to take out a quote-unquote terrorist, and they weigh the calculated risk of how many innocents that they will kill, and they came up with a term and just called it collateral damage, and those were acceptable losses just to take out that one perceived threat or who they have deemed a threat. So when he was talking about the trolley experience, for some reason, the term collateral damage came to my mind. Also, the portion about the Vikings, the berserkers, it takes how he was talking about how the berserkers were like the conquerors, the warrior class of the society, and how they were even needed to protect, you know, your group from the berserkers of the other group. And this is a question that I have asked years ago. And the question that I asked was, do we, as their victims, need to develop a berserker-like attitude in order to deal with these people? Do we have to become just as depraved, just as violent, just as psychopathic in order to I don't know, take them out? I don't know, but I mean, I thought that was interesting that they talked about, you know, berserkers and the role that they play in a particular group. So I don't know if is that why we tend to be victims and I'm speaking of non-white people in general terms, is because we don't have a bunch of psychopaths in our group. Not to say we don't have any, but I mean, perhaps we are not purposely using our psychopaths to go after our enemies. I don't know, but that kind of stood out to me. The term criminal and non-criminal psychopath, I didn't really get clarity on that, because to me it sounds like the non-criminal is just the one who hasn't been charged with a crime, but is engaged in you know, similar behavior, predatory behavior. And they talked about the professions. What would be the ideal, you know, with the college students and the little exercise? Well, what do you think would be the ideal profession for a psychopath? And of course, they did name the military, but they did not name, or perhaps he didn't share, cops. I thought about cops as well as politicians. But also when he was talking about the domestic violence, cops have, I'm trying to remember this correctly, but I think it is 4 times the rates of domestic violence against their partners than the general population. And so that kind of stood out to me as a profession where you might find a high percentage of psychopaths. And the last thing is when he talked about the reptilian, making the analogy to reptiles and I guess being cold-blooded or whatnot. But I've heard people, now they were talking about white people, but they were talking about a certain class of white people. And these are white people's terms, how they call these politicians, and as one of my friends calls them, celebrity figureheads. But let's say a person like a Donald Trump, they would literally be saying that these people aren't really human, that they're reptilian, that, you know, under their skin you'll find a reptile. And I thought it was interesting that he used that word reptilian. Thank you for allowing me to share.
Appreciate that, Mr. Reed. We had second question offered by Mr. Reed about do we need black psychopaths to solve this problem, or at least to adopt some of those traits to try to solve this problem. Other folks who had comments, if you had your own commentary and want to respond to the questions, feel free.
Can I be heard?
Yes, Emmy.
Can I be heard?
Thank you.
We heard you, Rob, in Wisconsin. We'll get Emmy first, and then we'll get you as well, sir.
I think it's a great question. I don't really see what's wrong with it. I don't know if the individuals really have to be psychopaths, but I definitely think that there might be some constructive use for maybe adopting some of the behaviors. And I think it's interesting that you could develop some of these behaviors via meditation, having like a cool, calm reserve. He just slightly mentioned it towards the end of the second reading, but I think because when I was hearing it, that's what I was hearing, that some of these traits are actually extremely beneficial, but you can achieve, you don't have to be a psychopath to be it, and, to have those characters. But at first he kept saying the word predator, 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 and I just kept hearing it from this one angle. But then I started thinking, perhaps this whole predator thing is a little bit more scientific than I thought originally. Being in biology class, we spend a whole lot, everything we're doing is about evolution. And they don't really talk about, we talk about the evolution of all kinds of things, and then they don't really want to go into how humans came to be. And they mentioned it something about their forebears or ancestors in Africa, or something white people really do think we're the missing link, and that they are the evolution to humanity, and they are the predator. Now, what happens in biology, extinction, let me get to the point, extinction, and that would be genocide. And so, the conversation, as far as I'm able to tell, will be that we were not able to adapt, which the author says something similar to that. Well, he doesn't say similar, but it's towards the end, he says that they're adapting. I have the note here, but I don't want to. They're continuing to evolve, and that the disorder is becoming adaptive. So if this becomes the norm, then those who aren't able to compete won't be fit. Fit doesn't mean strong, it means able to survive. And the conversation will be that non-white people were not able to adapt, were no longer fit, and therefore we were not able to survive. And then I think the quote about the insensitivity allows for them to rest while others are not. I think that's interesting, given how much we talk about not sleeping. And I know I don't get any sleep, and the anxiety and obsessiveness about what someone did, or workplace racism, or what I'm dealing with, and all this stuff, just the system of white supremacy in general. I'm just up thinking about it. And see, it does. White people get to go to work, terrorize, and practice their racism, go home, and sleep well knowing that you're not. And so I think that insensitivity might be one of the attributes that might be beneficial for non-white people. I think he mentions the decrease in heart rate under pressure. To me, that's codification. I hear that as codification. Being able to practice breathing, being calm, remaining calm, removing emotion, those traits are beneficial, and I think that that's codification. I just want to say that using the code pit bull, I thought that was interesting. Having a zero tolerance for anxiety, that I think is constructive. And I'll say again that they are evolving. They're actively evolving, doing all these biological concepts and whatnot, and selecting populations and cutting off other ones and all this kind of stuff, and that we might need to too. Thank you.
Appreciate that, Emmy. Rob in Wisconsin, if you could speak up, please, sir.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Very briefly.
Wait a minute. Is Robin was? I can hear you. I was just wanted to double check because
am I being heard clearly?
Yes, sir. Is this you, Rob? Rob, are you there?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, sir. We can hear you.
Hello.
Oh, we can hear you.
Am I being heard?
Yes, sir. We can hear you.
I'm being heard now?
Yes, sir.
Hello?
Yeah.
Okay. Very briefly, the word insensitivity stood out. The word insensitivity stood out, and through my study of people that classify themselves as white, it seems as though how Neely Fuller says that the system of white supremacy is very efficient, but destroys people in the process. That was clearly visible to me in the text, where it talked about the greasy pole, and it's easier to get up the pole if you're climbing on top of someone else. And to answer Mr. Reed's question, no, I do not agree or think that non-white people have to become psychopaths or take on the traits of a psychopath to effectively counter the system of white supremacy. And I just think that extreme codification would be a proper response to the system of white supremacy. And thank you.
Appreciate that, Robert in Wisconsin. Do we have anybody else who had a hand up? Anybody else that we missed? Caller at 4757. I think this is Mel, who did all our great narration. Or perhaps not.
Can I be heard?
Oh, yes, ma'am.
Okay, I'll try to make this really quick. So there is I wasn't here for the first section of the reading. I have to go back into the archives to listen to it. So if I'm restating anybody's points, I'm sorry about that. But from what I've heard of the last section where everyone was giving their feedback, as well as this feedback so far, it's been very helpful for me. I'm actually taking notes. There's a book about Thurgood Marshall called The Devil in the Grove that describes in its beginning how he and his law office would get thousands of requests for help from Black people who were being terrorized in various ways on sharecropping plantations, everything from like little girls being assaulted by grown white men. I mean, you would just get thousands of letters from people. And he said that there were so many letters of such deep sadness that he couldn't bring himself to give them to his secretaries to read, because he would share the letters he would get in his office with his staff. And to me, this is a kind of unfortunate, but not necessarily noble indifference. And I'm not sure if a calculating coldness is the same as a helpless numbness that I think Thurgood Marshall would feel in that situation. And I don't feel like the distinction is being made clearly enough when when the author in this book is using words like indifference or necessity to act in certain ways, or like a social utility for like dangerous tasks in our society. Like, I feel like the idea of taking noble, hard jobs or dirty work for society, like taking out the trash, is a utility. And if it pays well enough, if the trash man is treated well enough, if he has lots of overtime or paid time off, it doesn't seem like it's a bad deal. But I don't feel like economic hitmen or callous businessmen are necessities for a society. Yes, a community could use a defense, but what does a robust defense include? Maybe we need soldiers, but do we need horrifying examples of slaughter for your opponents to fear you? Like when he talks about the term Viking, and brings up the term berserker, I'm reminded, me personally, of the term race soldier, but a bomb disposal expert actually seems like a utility to me. Doesn't seem like a person who's out there just kind of almost has the ability to take liberties. And on the note of liberties, okay, hold on a second, sorry. On the note of liberties, he doesn't mention race enough for me, or at all actually in this section. I could be just missing over parts where he's talking about it, but the author writes that psychopaths really don't care what other people think, and that's one of the more basic, I guess, features about them. And it reminds me kind of people posing for photos and picnicking around lynchings. Like, I feel like the ability to not care about what other people think is inherent in those with power, and if you don't have power, you do have to care what other people think. But if we're talking about an entire race of people who have more power than another race, then to me, statistically, you might have more psychopaths popping up than the other one, but it's not, again, race isn't really mentioned as much. So I'm wondering if he's going to bring that up in the book. Technically, as a former metalhead and as a person who used to be interested in like goth subculture, punk rock subculture, and like black metal, death metal, so to speak, and stuff like that, I was interested in these things. It makes me interested in whether or not he's going to bring that up, because I do think those subcultures have a lot of violent imagery and death imagery in their communities in terms of psychopathy. And I've also found a lot of serial killer worship in those communities. So that's the thing I'm wondering if it'll be brought up. And when he says that the monk on the mountain, okay, I'm just saying a monk on the mountain is not a psychopath. I don't even think they're that close. The barrier of like morality and human decency seems minimized by the author when he's even using such a sentence. And I think that might be an act of racism, because racism it thrives on denying human beings and other life forms decency. And then when he picked Candyman in the section, The Sense of Fear, and I'm thinking, isn't Candyman black in the movie? And like, what color are like the volunteers of the subjects? Because the actor was a 6'5" like black man. That was Candyman. So when he mentions studies in the book, I'm always going to like question the race of the subjects in the studies, similar to how you would like question people in juries. And that was it. I have one more point, but it's kind of scattered. Thank you.
Appreciate that, Mel. Great observations. Caller at 8704. Did you have commentary? 8704.
Yes, may I be heard?
Yes, sir.
All the other callers are very intelligent, and I like listening to them. I have a little bit of commentary, and when I heard that, I tuned in towards the end. My name is James from Arizona. I usually call on workplace racism. When I tuned in towards the end, and he was describing psychopaths like the cobra and the pit bull, and I'm going to go ahead and guess that the writer, the author, was a white male. And this just shows me that white people as a whole are on code. And psychopath, I mean, it's a word, but what he was describing was martial arts techniques and how martial artists, they are able to control their insides. And I guess how he would link the monk to the psychopath is maybe the psychopath is one that maybe tried to control his insides and went out of control, and the monk was the one who was succeeded in controlling his insides. But I do know the martial arts classes I took, they always said, and these were soft arts classes, they said before you can control anything on the outside, you must be able to control everything on the inside of you. And that's what it sounded like this guy was describing. And it's kind of like fearful a little bit, because it sounds like that's how white people act. And that's why I say, it's just, man, these guys are on code, because, I mean, when you talk to them, they're just calm. And there was a caller before, how she described, it was on workplace racism, how when she goes to work, or I think class or something, how black people are just rushing to work and class all the time. But when you look at white people, they're calm, they're chill, they're cool. And it scares me, because they know how to stay calm, chill, and cool. And obviously they figured it out so much. They can do it and antagonize us so much from different angles to where we can't. And until we all get on code together and be able to control our insides, I don't know. But that's what I have to say. It just sounds like just straight martial arts techniques. And these people are on code, and they're noticing it. And by being able to notice it and spread the word, because, I mean, these are books, and I'm pretty sure a lot of white people read them, they're on code. So for non-white black folk, if we can control our insides and be on code, and when we see each other, just, man, because white folk, when they see each other and you see another black folk, they on code, you know what I mean? So they know when to talk what they talk about when they're not around black folk, but when they see black folk, they're like, oh, I mean, they give that look to each other, and they know what's up. But all I'm saying is it just sounded like some martial art techniques. And just an example, like I think it was like G.I. Joe 1 or G.I. Joe 2, when the ninja dude, he got captured and put in some sleeping tank. He like knew what time it was, and he like calmed himself down and stopped his heart, so he thought he was going to die, and released him. So it just sounds like martial arts techniques. And I guess when he said that the psychopath and the monk, they're close but afar, is maybe the monk just was the ninja who was able to succeed, the warrior, and the psychopath It's just the guy who couldn't control it. But it just sounds like it's just what he just described a bunch of white folk. They know what to do, and they know how to keep us from doing it. That's where I end. And I'm sure I'm not saying I'm intelligent or nothing, but that's just how I feel, and that's where I end.
Appreciate that, James. In Arizona, wow. I think we nabbed everybody. We are pretty much almost at the end. I'll just take 60 seconds to see if I can get in 3 quick points. One of them being pretty much all of the folks that he's used as examples thus far, unless I have missed something, have been males. And with the psychopaths, other than Tiger Woods, I think everybody's been a white male. Women are going to come up in the book, and he did have the portion in the reading today where he was talking about how females, perhaps they compensate by being smaller physically in stature, by being more alert to someone who might be a psychopath, who might be potentially dangerous, when he was talking about the hair standing up on your neck or getting that feeling as though you're in the presence of evil. He is going to talk about women psychopaths later in the book, and I even have a sound clip from one of his talks I'm going to use for one of the intros later on. The portion in the book, I thought you all touched on a lot of the great points. I would say non-white people, black people in particular, we just need a codified understanding of what racism is and what it means to be white, and then a codified application of that understanding in our thoughts, speech, conduct. I think that would exponentially speed up the process of solving this problem, whether that is applied with regards to counterviolence or just any of our other strategies in solving our problems. I think that's what we need, codified understanding of racism, white supremacy. The portion where they're talking, he's having a conversation with one of his white colleagues, and they're talking about whether or not you push the fat guy on the train tracks, and how there is a value to these people who do the work, the dirty work, as he calls it. I thought that was a great point. There's a substantial difference between a sanitation worker or someone who's doing a job that's unpleasant, as opposed to, it seems to me that they're talking about a lot of violence. And it's my view that the system of white supremacy requires violence. And I hear a lot of whites who have this very ideology that it's necessary to have people like this who carry out these murderous acts, who are willing to do killing, who maybe even enjoy killing, that we need those type of people around to get things done. That is racism, white supremacy code at its finest. Dr. Welsing, wow, when he says they're talking about what is the exact population of psychopaths, and he writes, see if I can get the whole portion here, about some people being squeamish. He says that, of course, leaves 10% unaccounted for, a less morally hygienic minority who, when push quite literally comes to shove, have little or no compunction about holding another person's life in the balance. But who is this unscrupulous minority? Who is this 10%? That number stood out to me. I think Dr. Welsing talked about 10% of the population being classified as white, just the symmetry with that number and talking about 10%. It seems that 10% of the folks that they studied were psychopaths. 90% of the people were not and had problems about pushing somebody on a train track. There was another great metaphor when he was talking about, again, the utility of having these psychopaths, these people that are willing to do the quote-unquote dirty work. He says that you need these folks who have the balls to pull the trigger, still get focused on the genital level somehow. Dr. Welsing, and doubly the trigger. Dr. Welsing's talked about that consistently, the great equalizer and the gun being the equivalent of the phallic symbol. I will leave it there. Ultraviolet, I think that term was used in Stanley Kubrick's film. The name of it just escapes me, but that is another one that is psychopathic violence. It is talked about relentlessly. Clockwork Orange, ultraviolence. That was the term used in the movie, where they had whites who just loved going around and killing and slaughtering. I'm sure that that movie is probably going to be mentioned in this book somewhere. I'll have to keep an eye out as we proceed through the text. With that, we'll be back next Friday, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific, for chapter number 2. Kevin Dutton, the Wisdom of Psychopaths. Thank all of the folks who participated. I hope it was worthy of your Friday evening. If you have comments, questions, people are listening to the archives. If you have a question or what have you, just drop an email untiljustice@gmail.com. We'll be reading this book probably for another 4 or 5 weeks, so we'll have ample time for additional comments, questions, the whole nine. We'll be here tomorrow, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific, for the compensatory call-in. We'll review news, observations from the last 7 days. Tune in. Looking forward to hearing from folks in about 24 hours. I will state again, I know it's the weekend. Sobriety would be best. It's great. You can go out and have a good time, but you still want to be codified. Race soldiers, they do not take vacations. They do not pause because it's a weekend. Often they will amplify their antics. So keep that in mind. We want to make sure that we can make great decisions. You never know when you're out and about having a good time where you might be stopped by a race soldier, badge or no, and have to make life-saving decisions. I think that can be best accomplished being sober. If you're going to be in a vehicle, driver or passenger, buckle up. In addition to being sober, you want to buckle up each and every time. Let's do everything we can to minimize contact with race soldiers, i.e., also known as slave catchers. With that, Creator, we ask that you help us remain patient with other Black people, victims of white supremacy. We ask that you help us remain patient with ourselves. Remind us to demonstrate the highest levels of Black self-respect at all times, in all places, each and every time we are in contact with another Black person. It has been time. Replace white supremacy with justice immediately. Cow signing out. Thanks all for tuning in.
Nigga, you so brainwashed. I'm a victim, brother. Problem. You're a victim. I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning. Shut up. The man has programmed my conditioning. Even my conditioning has been conditioned.